Before we begin, if you're enjoying this story and want to help the channel grow, please consider using your hype points on this video. It really helps Sleep Theories more than you possibly know. And if you'd like, drop a comment telling us what time it is, where you are, and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from, but only if you want to share. Now, let's get into tonight's story. The Chrono Files. The truth behind time travel. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, unmarked except for a single line of text printed in courier font. Open alone. No return address, no postage. Just a thin manila package that had been slipped under my apartment door while I was out buying coffee. The paper felt wrong in my hands. Too heavy, too smooth, like the kind of stock used for official documents, the kind that resists water and tearing, the kind designed to last. I should have thrown it away. Instead, I stood in my apartment hallway, afternoon light slanting through the window, and felt something shift in my chest. That primal instinct that warns you when you're about to cross a line, when you're about to learn something you can't unlearn. My hands were shaking as I tore it open. Inside was a USB drive wrapped in static-resistant foam, the metallicized bubble wrap crackling as I peeled it away. The kind used for sensitive electronics. The kind that suggests someone cares very much about what's inside. The drive itself was unmarked. No manufacturer logo, no capacity indicator. Just smooth black plastic that felt cold against my palm despite the warm apartment air. I plugged it into my laptop with the cautious curiosity of someone who knows better, but does it anyway. My antivirus software immediately flagged it as suspicious. I overrode the warning. Another mistake in a chain of mistakes that would define the next 2 weeks of my life. The drive contained a single folder titled Chrono OS, de class pending. Inside were dozens of files, most of them corrupted or heavily redacted. PDF documents reduced to black bars, video files that wouldn't open, throwing error messages about missing codecs, audio recordings that played only static, though sometimes within that static I thought I heard voices, fragments of conversation too distorted to understand. But one document opened perfectly. Operational anomalies requiring temporal review. The first page was clean, professional, the kind of government document I'd seen before in my work as a technical writer for defence contractors. Headers, footers, classification markings, everything looked legitimate, too legitimate to be a hoax. I assumed it was an elaborate prank anyway, the kind of thing conspiracy theorists cook up in their basements, mixing real document templates with fabricated content. I'd seen dozens of these over the years. They always had tells, inconsistent formatting, anachronistic language, small errors that gave away their fictional nature. This had none of those tells. The signatures at the bottom weren't fake. They belonged to real people. A former DARPA project manager whose name I recognised from declassified documents about advanced propulsion research. An analyst linked to the CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology who testified before Congress about intelligence failures. Their credentials checked out. Their signatures matched samples I found in publicly available documents. And then I saw the timestamp. Revised, January 1999, August 2019, March 2034. 3 revision dates. The first 2 made sense. Documents get updated. New information comes to light. Classifications change. But the date 2034 made the room feel suddenly colder. That's 9 years from now. 9 years in the future. I checked my laptop's clock. Checked my phone. Checked the calendar on my wall. All confirmed. Late 2025. The document had been revised in a future that hadn't happened yet. I spent the next 3 hours reading everything on that drive, piecing together a story that shouldn't exist. A story about programs that operated in the shadows of our government, about anomalies that couldn't be explained by conventional physics, about a conspiracy so vast and so carefully hidden that even suggesting it sounds absurd. But the evidence was there, scattered across decades, hidden in plain sight. I should tell you something about myself. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I don't believe in UFOs or secret societies or grand cover-ups. My background is in technical writing and document analysis. I spent 5 years working for defence contractors, helping turn classified research into comprehensible reports. I know how government documents look, how they read, how they're structured. That experience made me cautious, sceptical. I'd seen enough fabricated documents to spot the fakes, the inconsistencies, the tells that reveal when something is manufactured rather than authentic. These documents had none of those tells. They had the weight of truth, the boring, bureaucratic, soul-crushing truth of actual classified research, and that terrified me more than anything. This is what I found. Chapter 1. The Earliest Signs. The first document I read was titled Historical Temporal Anomalies, Preliminary Catalogue. It was a chronological list of incidents that government scientists had flagged as potential evidence of time manipulation. Not theory, not speculation. Evidence. I printed it out, spreading the pages across my desk. 53 incidents spanning from 1943 to 2011. Each one documented with the cold precision of scientific observation. Dates, locations, witness statements, measurements. The earliest entry was dated October 1943, the USS Eldridge incident. You've probably heard of it under its popular name, the Philadelphia Experiment. According to official records, it never happened. The Navy has consistently denied that any such experiment took place. They've dismissed it as urban legend, wartime rumour, the kind of story that spreads among sailors with too much time and too little information. But this document told a different story. It described an attempt to render a destroyer escort invisible to radar using high-powered electromagnetic fields. The experiment allegedly succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Witnesses reported the ship vanishing entirely in a flash of green light, reappearing briefly at the Norfolk Naval Shipyard in Virginia, then returning to Philadelphia's Naval Yard within minutes. The aftermath was horrific. Sailors were found fused into the metal hull, their bodies merged with steel bulkheads as if they'd been there when the ship was built. Others went insane, claiming they'd been trapped in a grey void where time didn't move, where they could see themselves from the outside, watching their own bodies frozen in place while their consciousness moved freely through space that shouldn't exist. 5 men vanished completely, never found, no bodies, no trace. The document labelled it Temporal Displacement, Uncontrolled, Origin, Unknown, Suspected Inadvertent Breach. Recommend avoiding all electromagnetic field densities above threshold beta 7. A handwritten note in the margin in faded blue ink read, "They didn't know what they were opening. We barely know now." The second entry was dated March 1955. A classified Air Force memo described non-linear radar echoes detected at multiple installations across the southwestern United States. The radar systems were picking up aircraft before they appeared in the sky. Not seconds before, minutes. In one case, nearly 20 minutes before a B-52 bomber entered the detection range, the radar showed its signature clearly on screen. Operators reported the contact, scrambled interceptors, then watched as the ghost disappeared. 20 minutes later, exactly where the echo had predicted, the actual bomber appeared on schedule. The phenomenon occurred 17 times over 3 months, always in the southwest, always with military aircraft, always with the same temporal offset, between 15 and 22 minutes. The memo concluded, equipment malfunction ruled out, phenomenon repeatable under controlled conditions, cause unknown, hypothesis, temporal echo from future flight path interacting with present moment detection grid. Someone had underlined that last sentence in red ink. Next to it, in the same hand, we're seeing their shadows before they arrive. The third entry was a photograph dated February 1962. It showed the launch of Friendship 7, John Glenn's orbital mission, the first American to orbit Earth. The photograph captured the crowd of spectators gathered to witness history. Thousands of faces turned skyward, watching the Atlas rocket climb into the Florida sky. But someone had circled 2 faces in the background. The same man, same clothing, same posture, same expression of awe and excitement, standing in two different locations simultaneously, roughly 30 feet apart. The image quality was poor by modern standards, but good enough to be certain. Not twins, not lookalikes, the same person. Every detail matched. The pattern on his tie, the way his hair fell across his forehead, the exact angle of his head as he watched the launch. A handwritten note in the margin read, "Temporal echo, observer from displaced frame, subject identified as civilian employee of NASA's propulsion division, interviewed under pretense of security clearance review, no memory of being in two locations, polygraph inconclusive, recommend monitoring, consult variant protocols." A second note, dated 5 years later. Subject died June 1967. Natural causes. Case closed. But underneath, in different handwriting, or did his other self die? How do we know which one we buried? The fourth entry was from June 1969. NASA mission logs from Apollo 10 mentioned time index drift anomalies in signal delays between the spacecraft and ground control. Communications were arriving fractionally too early or too late, inconsistent with the known distance and light speed calculations. The discrepancies were small, measured in milliseconds, but they were there, consistent, measurable. One engineer had written in the margin, "Not equipment error, signal travelling non-standard route, possibility, gravitational lensing around lunar mass, alternative hypothesis, temporal distortion field interaction, recommend further study." That further study apparently never happened. Or if it did, those files weren't on the USB drive, but there were more entries. So many more. August 1974. A weather satellite photographed a B-2 stealth bomber over Nevada. The B-2 wouldn't have its first flight until July 1989. 15 years in the future. December 1981. A CIA safe house in Berlin received a telephone call warning of a Soviet defector's assassination attempt. The call was logged at 3:47 p.m. The assassination attempt occurred at 3:12 p.m. the same day, 35 minutes before the warning. May 1993. Seismographs at the University of California recorded earthquake tremors exactly 24 hours before a magnitude 6.1 quake struck near Los Angeles. The equipment was functioning normally. The tremors matched the actual quake's signature perfectly. They simply arrived one day early. September 2001. This entry was heavily redacted. Only fragments remained visible. Multiple temporal anomalies detected in week preceding events. FAA radar logs show impossible flight paths, timeline inconsistencies in passenger manifests, communications intercepted with timestamps from non-existent dates. The implications of that one made my mouth go dry. November 2008. Stock trading algorithms detected patterns that shouldn't exist. Multiple securities moved in ways that anticipated news events, minutes or hours before those events occurred, not insider trading. The movements began before the events themselves, as if the market knew what was coming before it happened. The document noted, pattern consistent with information leakage from future time frame, suggests temporal breach by financial actor with access to next-day data, investigation ongoing. As I read through these entries, a pattern emerged that was impossible to ignore. The government wasn't searching for time travel. They were reacting to it, documenting it, trying desperately to understand what they were observing. These weren't experiments. They were observations, evidence that someone, somewhere, was already manipulating time, and the government was desperately trying to understand how. The final page of the catalogue contained a summary assessment, dated August 2011. Temporal anomalies have increased in frequency and magnitude over the past 6 decades. Early incidents appeared spontaneous or accidental. Recent events suggest deliberate manipulation by actor or actors unknown. Technology origin uncertain. Capability assessment exceeds known human scientific achievement by estimated 30 to 50 years minimum. Recommendation: expedite defensive temporal research. Priority: critical. Underneath, someone had written in pencil, We're not the first ones to discover this. We're just the first ones to notice we're not first. Chapter 2. The First Program. The next document was titled Project Variant, Executive Summary. The paper was yellowed with age, clearly a scan of an original document from the 1960s. Coffee stains marked the margins. Someone had dog-eared the corners, leaving creases that had hardened over decades. Project Variant was a Cold War program created under DARPA's umbrella sometime in the early 1960s. Its stated purpose was deliberately vague: study of time-indexed distortions and their implications for national security. The kind of language designed to deflect questions rather than answer them. But reading between the lines, studying the actual research methodology and objectives buried in the technical sections, its real purpose became crystal clear. They weren't trying to build a time machine. They were trying to detect when someone else already had. The program assembled a team of brilliant minds. Real people whose names I recognised immediately. Physicist John Archibald Wheeler, who worked on nuclear weapons and quantum mechanics, whose work on black holes coined the term itself. Mathematician Freeman Dyson, known for his work on quantum field theory and space exploration, whose Dyson sphere concept had captured imaginations for decades, and a young consultant named Eric Weinstein, whose background in mathematical physics and geometric unity made him valuable to programs exploring reality's fundamental structure. The document included photographs, grainy black and white images of men in suits standing before chalkboards covered in equations, laboratory spaces filled with equipment I couldn't identify, banks of computers the size of refrigerators, their magnetic tape reels spinning endlessly. Variant's methodology was surprisingly straightforward. They weren't conducting experiments, they were conducting archaeology, digging through historical data looking for inconsistencies, anomalies, places where reality didn't quite match what it should have been, photographs where shadows didn't match the documented time of day, government records that referenced events before they happened, satellite imagery showing structures that appeared and disappeared without explanation, radio signals that preceded their supposed transmission times. They treated history itself as a crime scene, searching for evidence of tampering. What they found disturbed them deeply. One report, dated June 1965, described repeated anomalies around nuclear test sites. Instruments recorded gamma radiation spikes before detonations occurred, not milliseconds before, minutes, in some cases, hours. The report included graphs showing radiation levels over time, normal background levels, then sudden spikes, then return to normal. Then, later, the actual nuclear detonation would occur, creating an identical spike. As if the radiation from the blast was somehow echoing backward through time. The scientists tested for equipment malfunction. They calibrated instruments. They ran control experiments. The phenomenon persisted. In 17 out of 23 tests, they detected the detonation before it happened. Another report, dated November 1967, mentioned data that changed retroactively. A classified document about a missile test would be filed with specific technical details: range, altitude, velocity, payload configuration. Months later, someone would reference the same document and find different numbers, different outcomes, as if the test itself had been altered after the fact and the records updated to match. The scientists documented 6 cases where multiple people remembered reading the same document with different information. In one case, they found 3 versions of the same report, each with contradictory data, all bearing identical classification stamps and filing dates. It was as if reality couldn't decide what had actually happened. The most unsettling finding involved satellite photographs of Soviet installations. Multiple images taken over several months showed a research facility in Siberia with mismatched shadows. Buildings casting shadows in directions that didn't correspond to the sun's position at the documented time and date. But it wasn't random. The shadows were consistent with the sun's position from 3 hours earlier, every single photograph, as if someone had travelled back 3 hours and taken pictures, but the camera's internal clock still recorded the future time. The Variant team reached a conclusion that must have terrified anyone who read it. Evidence suggests active temporal manipulation by unknown actor or actors. Origin point uncertain, technology unknown. Capability assessment beyond current human achievement by minimum 30-year advancement margin. Possible explanations: A. Foreign power with significant technological advantage. B. Non-state actor with access to future technology. C. Incursion from alternate timeline or future period. All explanations require immediate strategic response. In other words, someone was changing time, and it wasn't us, and we had no idea who they were or what they were trying to achieve. A handwritten note at the bottom of the page, signed by Freeman Dyson, read, "If this is real, we're observing the echoes of a war we don't know we're fighting. Worse, we may have already lost and simply haven't experienced the defeat yet." The next several pages detailed proposed research directions. Most were heavily redacted, but fragments remained visible. Temporal shielding mechanisms to prevent unauthorized historical modification. Detection grid for real-time temporal breach identification. Quantum entanglement as early warning system for timeline divergence. Possibility of establishing temporal beachhead in strategically significant historical moments. That last one was marked rejected ethical concerns in red ink, but someone had drawn an arrow to the margin and written, "Revisit if threat assessment escalates." The final document in the variant section was a memo dated April 1978. Project Variant suspended pending technology advancement. Current methodologies insufficient for defensive temporal capability development. Recommend archival of all research pending future revival when quantum computing and advanced sensor arrays become viable. Team disbanded. All personnel to receive Class A Amnesia Protocol briefing. Class A Amnesia Protocol. I had to look that up. It wasn't what it sounded like. They weren't erasing memories. They were convincing people their memories were unreliable. A psychological technique to make witnesses doubt their own experiences, to plant uncertainty where certainty had existed. The people who'd worked on Variant left the program questioning everything they'd learned, unsure what was real and what was misremembered, unable to talk about their work even if they wanted to, because they no longer trusted their own recollections. It was erasure without erasing anything, destruction of evidence without destroying a single document. And it meant that somewhere out there, brilliant scientists who'd glimpsed the truth about temporal manipulation were living their lives convinced they'd imagined it all. Chapter 3. The Breakthrough Nobody Wanted. The next file was dated July 1978 and marked Eyes Only, compartmented. The classification marking alone told me this was different, more sensitive, more dangerous. It described something called the Montauk acquisition. According to the document, Variant scientists had acquired a device through channels that weren't disclosed. The language was careful, almost evasive. Device obtained through non-standard procurement methodology. Origin point classified above project clearance level. Provenance uncertain, but materials analysis confirms human manufacture. The device wasn't extraterrestrial in origin. It was human-made, but the materials used in its construction didn't match anything in the periodic table as it existed in 1978. Alloys that shouldn't have been possible to create. Components that operated on principles physics hadn't yet discovered. Manufacturing techniques that wouldn't exist for decades. Someone, somewhere in time, had built this machine, and somehow it ended up in a DARPA laboratory in 1978. The report included technical specifications that read like science fiction. Quantum field manipulator utilizing controlled chronological shear. Operates by creating localized temporal distortion field approximately 0.3 meters in diameter. Power requirements minimal. Device appears to draw energy from ambient quantum vacuum fluctuations. In simpler terms, it ran on nothing. It pulled power from empty space itself. The device was roughly the size of a briefcase. The photographs showed something that looked almost mundane. A metal box covered in what appeared to be circuit boards, though the circuits followed patterns that made no sense. Spirals, fractals, geometric designs that hurt to look at too long, as if they were somehow wrong in a way the human brain couldn't process. It emitted a low-frequency hum that instruments measured as temporal shear, a term the scientists had to invent because no existing vocabulary described what they were observing. The sound registered at 15 hertz, just at the edge of human hearing, but people reported feeling it rather than hearing it. A vibration in their bones, a pressure behind their eyes. When activated, the device created what witnesses described as a shimmering plane in the air. Not quite a doorway, more like a window into nothing. A vertical surface that reflected no light but distorted everything around it, creating ripples in space like heat waves rising from summer pavement. But this wasn't heat, this was time itself bending. The report detailed the first test, conducted on July 19, 1978, at 3:27 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. The device was activated in a sealed laboratory at an undisclosed location. 8 witnesses present, all with top-secret clearances, all scientists or military personnel. The shimmer appeared, instantly. A perfect rectangle of distorted space, roughly 2 meters tall and 1 meter wide. Through it, witnesses reported seeing nothing. Not darkness. Nothing. An absence of reality that the human eye struggled to process. A technician named Michael Reeves volunteered to investigate. According to his personnel file, he was 29 years old, unmarried, with advanced degrees in electrical engineering and physics. The kind of person who'd spent his life asking questions, pushing boundaries, wanting to know what was on the other side of every mystery. He reached out and touched the surface. The report described what happened in clinical language, but I could read the terror between the lines. Subject's hand made contact with temporal boundary at 15:27 and 33 seconds. Hand disappeared immediately upon contact. Subject reported no sensation of pain or resistance. Appeared to reach through surface as through water, though surface remained solid to visual inspection. Subject leaned forward. Entire body passed through boundary at 15:27 and 41 seconds. Subject vanished from observation. For 6 seconds, according to the lab's clocks, Michael Reeves ceased to exist. The observers watched the shimmer, waiting. Some reported hearing sounds from the other side. Voices. Wind. Something that might have been music or might have been machinery. The recordings captured only static, but 17 different people insisted they'd heard something. At 15:27 and 47 seconds, Michael Reeves stumbled backward out of the shimmer, gasping for air like a drowning man breaking the surface. His skin was blue-white, covered in a layer of frost despite the laboratory's carefully controlled 72-degree temperature. Ice crystals had formed on his eyelashes, in his hair, on his fingertips. He collapsed immediately. Medical personnel rushed to stabilize him. His core body temperature dropped to 89 degrees Fahrenheit. Severe hypothermia. His extremities showed signs of frostbite. His pupils were dilated, unresponsive to light. When he could finally speak, his story made no sense. He claimed he'd been gone for hours, said he'd walked through the shimmer and found himself standing on a street in Manhattan. 5th Avenue, he thought, though nothing looked quite right. The buildings were familiar but wrong, taller in some places, missing in others. The sky was grey, completely grey, no sun visible but somehow light everywhere. No shadows, and it was silent, completely, utterly silent. No traffic, no voices, no wind, no sounds at all except his own footsteps echoing impossibly loud in the empty streets. He walked for what felt like 2 hours trying to find someone, anyone. Every store was empty, every car abandoned. He looked through windows into apartments and saw furniture, belongings, signs of life, but no people, as if the entire city had been evacuated in the middle of an ordinary day. The cold grew worse as he walked. His breath fogged in the grey air. His fingers went numb. He tried door after door looking for shelter, but every entrance was locked or led to more empty rooms. Finally, after wandering for what he estimated was 2 hours, the shimmer reappeared in front of him, a rectangle of distorted space hovering in the middle of 5th Avenue. He ran toward it, fell through it, and found himself back in the lab. 6 seconds. That's how long he'd been gone according to every clock in the laboratory. 6 seconds according to the video recording. 6 seconds according to 17 witnesses. But his body told a different story. Medical examination revealed severe frostbite on his hands and face, deep tissue damage consistent with prolonged cold exposure. His internal body temperature suggested he'd been in freezing conditions for at least 90 minutes. His watch, a mechanical Omega Speedmaster that kept accurate time to within seconds per day, showed that 2 hours and 17 minutes had elapsed. Time inside the shimmer ran differently, dramatically, impossibly differently. The report included interview transcripts. Reeves describing what he'd seen, what he'd felt. Medical personnel asking questions, trying to understand. And underneath it all, the growing sense that they'd opened something that shouldn't have been opened. One exchange stood out. "Can you describe the quality of the light?" It was everywhere and nowhere, like being inside a photograph. Flat, no depth. "Did you see the sun?" "No, just grey sky. But I could see perfectly. Everything was visible but nothing cast shadows." "Did you try to take anything with you?" Long pause on the recording. "Yes. There was a newspaper box on a corner. The window was broken. I reached in and grabbed a paper. The New York Times, I think. But when I looked at it, the pages were blank. Not empty. Blank. Like they'd never been printed. Just white paper." "What did you do with it?" "I dropped it. It scared me more than the empty streets." The final page of the report was a memo from the project director. "Immediate shutdown ordered. Device to be sealed and stored. All personnel to undergo evaluation. This line of research is suspended indefinitely." Someone had written in the margin, "We opened a door we can't close." Chapter 4. The 1990s Revival. For over a decade, Project Variant remained dormant. The device was locked away. The research was buried. But technology advances. What seemed impossible in 1978 looked achievable by 1993. The rise of quantum computing changed everything. A new program emerged, classified under the codename Project Paramount. This time, the scientists involved weren't just physicists. They included specialists in quantum mechanics, theoretical mathematics, and computer science. Real names appeared in the documents again. Kip Thorne, whose work on black holes and wormholes was well known. David Deutsch, a pioneer in quantum computation. Seth Lloyd, an expert in quantum information theory. Paramount's documents discussed concepts that sounded like science fiction, but were rooted in real physics. Closed time-like curves, quantum entanglement across temporal dimensions, something called chronological shielding that would prevent paradoxes. The goal wasn't to create a traditional time machine, it was to establish what they called quantum temporal tunneling, using entangled particles to send information backward through time without physically moving matter. But buried in the technical documents was something that made my stomach turn. An internal memo dated December 1997. If temporal manipulation is achieved, it must remain unilateral. Parallel access by competing nations leads to immediate timeline collapse. Multiple actors attempting concurrent manipulation creates cascading paradoxes. Result, unpredictable, potentially catastrophic reality fragmentation. In simpler terms, if every country gets time travel, the present becomes meaningless. Reality itself becomes unstable. Another memo, dated 6 months later. Consensus reached. Technology must be controlled absolutely. Access limited to single authorized entity. Temporal manipulation to be treated as ultimate strategic weapon. Unauthorized use. Grounds for preemptive action. They were planning to monopolize time travel, to ensure that only one group, one government, one carefully controlled program could access this technology. And they were willing to go to war to protect that monopoly. Chapter 5. The whistleblower who never existed. One name kept appearing in the documents. Leon Varick. He was identified as a former NSA contractor who'd worked on Paramount before leaving under unclear circumstances. Multiple memos referenced his concerns about the program's direction. his warnings about temporal ethics violations, his increasingly desperate attempts to expose what he'd learned. I decided to find him. It didn't take long to hit a wall. There were no birth records for Leon Varick, no social security number, no employment history outside the classified documents on the USB drive. DMV records showed nothing. Credit bureaus had no file. But there was one thing, a photograph. It appeared in newspaper archives from a protest in Washington during 2003. Environmental activists demonstrating against government energy policy. In the background, partially obscured by other protesters, was a man matching Varick's description from the documents. The photograph was blurry but distinctive enough to be useful. I downloaded it 3 times over the next week. Each time I looked at it, something bothered me. Finally, I compared all 3 versions side by side. The timestamp on the photograph was different in each file. Same image, same newspaper archive. But the metadata showed 3 different dates: October 2003, November 2003, and January 2004. A digital photograph can't exist with 3 different creation dates unless someone has been altering it. Not the image itself, the moment it was taken. I hired a private investigator, someone who specialised in finding people who didn't want to be found. She came back with news that made me question everything. "Your man Varick died in 1987, she said. Single vehicle accident in Colorado. Drove off a mountain road. Body was identified through dental records." I showed her the documents from 2003, the photograph from the protest. She shrugged. "Then either those documents are fake or your guy lived after he died." The third option, the one neither of us wanted to say out loud, was that Leon Varick had been pulled forward through time, that he died in 1987 in one timeline and continued living in another, that he was proof of what the government had achieved, and that someone had erased him from history to cover it up. That night, I started noticing things, small things. A car parked across the street that I'd never seen before. The same man in a grey jacket standing at the bus stop 3 days in a row, never getting on a bus. My apartment door lock feeling different, as if someone had practiced with it while I was out. I checked for bugs. Found nothing. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, and everyone who works in defence knows that if someone really wants to surveil you, you'll never find their equipment. I started varying my routine, taking different routes to the coffee shop, using different computers at different libraries to research, paying cash for everything. Basic tradecraft, the kind they teach you in security clearance briefings. It didn't help. The feeling of being watched only intensified. On the 4th day after I'd hired the investigator, she called me. Her voice was different, tight, scared. "We need to stop," she said. "I can't work this case anymore." "Why? What did you find?" "I didn't find anything, that's the problem. Your guy Varick, he's connected to things I can't touch. I got warned off, politely but firmly, by people who knew things about me they shouldn't know, things I've never told anyone." "What kind of things?" She hung up. When I called back, her number was disconnected. Her office, when I drove past it, was empty. A Felice sign in the window as if she'd never been there at all. I went home and found my apartment door unlocked. Nothing was missing, nothing was moved. But on my desk, right where I worked, was a business card. Plain white, no logo. Just a phone number in embossed black text. I stared at it for an hour before I called. A man answered on the first ring. No greeting, just, "We know you have questions. We may have some answers, but you need to stop digging into Leon Varick for your own safety." Who is this? Someone who knows what you've been reading. Someone who knows you received certain documents that you shouldn't have. Those documents are incomplete, taken out of context. They tell a story, but not the whole story. "Then tell me the whole story." Long pause. I could hear him breathing, weighing his options. "Not over the phone. Maybe not at all. But if you keep pursuing this, you're going to find things that can't be unfound. And the people who manage those things will notice. They'll want to know how you learned what you learned. And then your life becomes very complicated very quickly. Is that a threat? It's a warning from someone who used to have your level of clearance. who used to ask the same questions, who learned the hard way that some doors once opened can't be closed. You worked on Variant. Another pause, longer this time. I worked on something. Whether it was Variant or one of its successor programs, I couldn't tell you. They compartmentalise everything. You might spend years on a project and never know its real name or purpose. You just do your part, answer your questions, write your reports, and hope you never see the bigger picture, but you saw it. Pieces, fragments. Enough to know I should have stayed ignorant. Enough to know that what they're doing, what they've been doing for decades, it changes everything. Everything you think you know about reality, about history, about the way the world works, it's all provisional, subject to revision, and you're not invited to the meeting where those revisions are decided. Tell me about Leon Varick. The line went dead. I never heard from that number again. When I tried calling back, I got a recording. This number is not in service. But the message was clear. I was getting close to something. Close enough that someone felt the need to warn me off, which meant Leon Varick was real, which meant the documents were real, which meant everything else in those files, all the impossible claims about time travel and timeline manipulation, was probably real too. Chapter 6. The Present Day Program. The most recent document on the USB was titled Time Access Restriction 204 Protocol. It was marked with a classification level I'd never seen before, Umbra Cardinal. The document described what it called the stabilization crisis. After 1991, unauthorized timeline incursions had spiked dramatically. Someone was accessing temporal manipulation technology and using it without coordination. The results were catastrophic. Temporal leakage was detected around major historical events. Predictive models generated by intelligence agencies were aligning too perfectly with actual outcomes. Financial markets moved with impossible precision. Political developments followed paths that seemed scripted. In March 2012, a major temporal breach occurred. The document didn't specify details, but it described reality coherence failure in multiple probability streams. Whatever happened, it required immediate intervention. Since 2014, all time travel had been restricted to what they called Timeline 204, a single, carefully controlled probability stream that was being actively maintained and monitored. Only a small group within the intelligence community had access. Every incursion required approval. Every change was documented. The protocol document explained the reasoning. Multiple timeline access creates exponential instability. Each separate incursion spawns alternate realities that can interact destructively. The only viable solution is to limit temporal manipulation to a single authorized stream, preventing reality fragmentation. In other words, time travel exists, it's operational, and it's being used. But only by one group, following one timeline, making one version of history. A handwritten note at the bottom read, "What we're doing isn't time travel. It's timeline curation. We're not visiting the past. We're editing it." Chapter 7. The Proof Hidden in Plain Sight. The USB drive contained one audio file. It took me several attempts to access it. The encryption was military grade. When I finally got it open, a voice began speaking, digitally scrambled. Impossible to identify. If you're hearing this, you've gotten further than most. You deserve the truth. The voice explained that time travel isn't like the movies. You don't jump backward into your own past. That's impossible. Causality doesn't allow it. Instead, you shift into a parallel timeline that closely mirrors your target era. The technology creates a quantum bridge between your present and an alternate reality's past. You visit that world, interact with it, make changes. Those changes don't rewrite your world. They can't. Your timeline continues unchanged, but the alternate timeline you visited now develops differently. It branches off, spawning a new probability stream. When you return, you bring back information, objects, sometimes even people, though the voice said that was ethically complex and highly restricted. This avoids paradoxes entirely. You can't kill your own grandfather because he isn't your grandfather. He's a version of him in a parallel world. Your timeline remains stable. You gain the benefits of temporal access without the risks, but it creates something else, an infinite number of splintered worlds, alternate realities where different versions of events play out, worlds that exist because someone from our timeline went back and changed something. The voice described how the United States has been using this technology for years. They gather information from alternate futures, test policy decisions by implementing them in parallel timelines and observing results, study disasters before they happen by visiting timelines where they've already occurred, and most disturbingly, they conduct ethical extractions. They remove objects or people from timelines that are designated as non-viable, realities that are destined to collapse or face catastrophic outcomes. We're not just observing, the voice said. We're harvesting, taking what we need from worlds that won't survive anyway. The recording ended with a warning. The program is expanding, more timelines, more incursions. Eventually we'll lose track. We'll forget which reality is original, and when that happens, we'll have to choose which version of history becomes real. Chapter 8. The Final File. One file remained on the USB drive. It was heavily encrypted, protected by multiple security layers. I spent 3 days trying to crack it. When I finally succeeded, the file contained a single sentence. You were not meant to see this version of the future. Before I could process what that meant, the USB drive began to heat up in my laptop, rapidly. I yanked it out, burning my fingers, and dropped it on my desk. It melted, not like plastic melting in fire. It dissolved into a grey powder that spread across the desk surface like liquid smoke. Within seconds, there was nothing left but a faint stain. I checked my laptop. The files were gone, completely erased. No trace in the trash folder. No recovery possible. Every backup I'd made was corrupted. The documents I'd printed had somehow become unreadable. The text faded to nothing on the pages. Someone had triggered a remote wipe, not just of the drive, of every copy I'd made. But I still had my memory. I still knew what I'd read. Epilogue. A message from another timeline. 3 days after the USB drive dissolved, I received a text message from a number I didn't recognize. It contained 3 things: a date, a set of coordinates, and a message. The date was 2 weeks from when I received it. The coordinates pointed to a location in Nevada. When I looked them up, they corresponded to an abandoned Air Force facility that had been closed since the early 2000s. Government records showed it was a former radar station, but cross-referencing with the variant documents revealed something else. The facility had been used for classified research in the 1960s and 70s. It was one of Project Variant's original sites. The message read, "This is the timeline where you find the truth." I stared at my phone, trying to make sense of it. The number showed no caller ID. When I tried calling back, I got a recording saying the number didn't exist. The text deleted itself while I watched, just vanished from my screen. When I checked my message logs, there was no record it had ever existed, but I'd written down the coordinates. I still had the date. I'm sitting here now, trying to decide what to do. The rational part of my brain says this is elaborate misdirection, a way to discredit anyone who might have seen those documents. Go chasing into the desert looking for answers, and you'll find nothing but empty buildings and your own paranoia. But the other part of my brain remembers that timestamp. The document revised in 2034. The technologies described that don't exist yet. The voice on the recording that sounded too certain, too detailed to be fiction. What if the message wasn't from someone else? What if it came from me? A version of myself from a timeline where I made the trip, where I found whatever is waiting at those coordinates. A version trying to guide this version toward the same discovery. The date is tomorrow. The drive to Nevada would take about 6 hours. I've already packed a bag, already cleared my schedule. I know I'm going to go, even though every instinct tells me this is dangerous. Because if time travel exists, if the government has been using it to reshape reality, if we're living in a carefully curated timeline maintained by people we'll never see, then someone needs to know. Someone needs to document this, to preserve the evidence, to make sure the truth doesn't get erased the way Leon Varick was erased. Chapter 9. The Nevada Facility. I need to tell you what happened when I drove out there. I need to record this while the memory is fresh, while I still trust my own mind. The coordinates led me to a stretch of desert 3 hours northeast of Las Vegas. Nothing on the map except empty land. No roads, no structures, just scrub land and rock formations that looked like they'd been there since the planet cooled. I left my car 5 miles from the coordinates and hiked the rest of the way. Basic operational security. If someone was monitoring the site, I didn't want my vehicle showing up on satellite imagery. The desert in late afternoon is beautiful in a hostile way. Everything sharp and bright and trying to kill you. The sun pounds down with physical force. The air is so dry it pulls moisture from your lungs. Your shadow stretches out behind you like an accusation. I found the facility just before sunset. It wasn't abandoned. Not exactly. The buildings were there, low concrete structures half buried in sand, but they didn't look old enough. The concrete was too clean. The metal doors showed no rust despite decades in the desert. Someone was maintaining this place, or it had been built more recently than the documents suggested. The main entrance was sealed, but I found a service door around the back that had been forced open recently. The marks on the lock were fresh, the metal bright where tools had scratched it. I wasn't the first person to find this place. Someone else had been here. Maybe the person who sent me the USB drive. Maybe someone looking for the same answers I was. Inside, the facility was dark. My flashlight beam cut through dust that hung in the air like fog. The place smelled of ozone and something else. Something chemical and sharp that made my eyes water. The first room was an equipment bay. Racks of electronics covered in dust sheets. Computer terminals from the 1980s. Their CRT monitors, dark and dead. Filing cabinets with their drawers hanging open, emptied of documents years ago. But on the walls, someone had left messages, written in marker, scrawled in haste. They're watching from multiple time frames. Don't trust your memories. The device is still here, still active. If you can read this, you're in the wrong timeline. That last one made my hand shake. The handwriting was familiar. Similar to the notes I'd seen in the margins of the USB documents. Similar to my own handwriting. I moved deeper into the facility. The corridor stretched ahead, lined with doors that opened onto empty offices and laboratories stripped of equipment. In one room, I found a chalkboard covered in equations. Complex mathematics that I couldn't follow but recognised as dealing with quantum mechanics and temporal physics. At the bottom, in neater handwriting than the wall messages, the probability of this timeline stability, declining, estimated collapse window, indeterminate, recommend immediate extraction of critical personnel. The facility's heart was 3 levels down, accessible by a stairwell that descended into darkness. Emergency lighting cast everything in red. My footsteps echoed off concrete walls. The lowest level was different. The air was colder, the ozone smell was stronger, and there was a sound. Low frequency, barely audible. The same 15 Hz hum that the Montauk documents had described. The device was here, still operational, still humming with power it shouldn't have. I found it in what must have been the main laboratory. A large room with reinforced walls and a ceiling covered in sensors and cameras. In the centre, on a platform surrounded by equipment I couldn't identify, was a metal case roughly the size of a briefcase. The Montauk device, or one like it. It was active. The surface glowed with a faint blue light that pulsed in rhythm with the hum, and in front of it, suspended in the air, was the shimmer, the temporal boundary the documents had described, a vertical plane of distorted space that rippled like water but remained perfectly still. I approached slowly. The closer I got, the more wrong everything felt. Time seemed to move strangely near the shimmer. My watch was running slow. My phone showed impossible times, jumping forward and backward by minutes. Through the shimmer, I could see something. Not nothing, like the original experiment had reported. There was landscape on the other side. Desert, but different. The rock formations were in slightly different positions. The sky was the wrong colour, a shade of grey-blue that nature doesn't make. And there was writing, carved into a rock formation visible through the shimmer. Large letters, deep cuts, done by someone with time and tools. You made it. Now decide if you want to go back. I stepped closer, close enough to feel the shimmer's effect. The air around it was cold despite the facility's warmth. My breath fogged. The hum was so loud now. It wasn't a sound anymore, it was a physical sensation vibrating through my bones. I could reach through, could walk into that alternate timeline and see what was waiting on the other side, could find answers that no documents would ever provide. But I thought about Michael Reeves, about his 2 hours in an empty New York, about the grey sky and silent streets and blank newspapers, about how he'd barely made it back. I thought about Leon Varick, about living after he died, about being erased from history in one timeline while existing in another. I thought about the voice on the recording, about timeline proliferation and ethical extractions and realities being chosen while others were allowed to collapse, and I stepped back. Whatever was on the other side of that shimmer, whatever truth was waiting in that alternate timeline, I wasn't ready to face it. Not alone. Not without understanding more about what I was dealing with. I took photographs, documented everything I could see, made notes on my phone about the equipment, the measurements, the messages on the walls, evidence that this place existed, that the device was real, that everything in the USB documents was true. Then I left, climbed back up 3 levels of stairs, walked back through empty corridors, emerged into Nevada sunset that looked almost painfully normal after what I'd seen below. The hike back to my car took 2 hours in darkness. I drove straight through to home, stopping only for gas, afraid that if I slept I'd wake up and find my memories had changed, find the photographs deleted, find everything from the facility erased like it had never been. But the evidence was still there when I got home. Still there when I backed it up to 3 different drives and uploaded it to a cloud service under a fake account. Still there the next morning when I woke up and checked again. Maybe that's why I received the USB drive in the first place. Not to stop what's happening, but to witness it, to record it, to leave a trail for whoever comes next. I don't know what I'll find in Nevada. I don't know if the coordinates will lead to answers or just more questions. But I know that in 2 weeks, either I'll have proof that everything I've told you is real, or I'll be another anomaly. Another person who got too close to something they weren't supposed to see. Another ghost in the timeline. If you're hearing this story, it means I decided to share it before making the trip. Insurance, maybe. Or just the desperate need to tell someone what I found before I chase it any further. Remember the names, remember the programs, remember that somewhere in the machinery of government, in laboratories and facilities you'll never see, people are making decisions about which version of reality gets to exist. And remember that the timeline you're living in right now, the history you think you know, might not be the original, might not be the only one. It might just be the one they chose for you. The coordinates are waiting, the date is tomorrow, and somewhere in the Nevada desert, in an abandoned facility that officially doesn't exist anymore, the truth is waiting. I'm going to find it, and if this is the timeline where that's supposed to happen, then I'm already on the path, already following the breadcrumbs left by a version of myself who made it further than I have. The real question isn't whether I'll go. The real question is whether I'll come back. And if I do, will it still be me? Will it still be this timeline? Or will I return carrying knowledge from somewhere else? Some other probability stream? Some other version of history where the answers were different? Where the truth was something else entirely? I guess I'll find out tomorrow. We'll find out together. Because if time travel is real, if the government has been using it to control history, then this isn't just my story, it's everyone's story. We're all living in a timeline someone else chose, walking paths that were selected by people with access to technology we can't imagine. And maybe, just maybe, it's time we started asking questions, started demanding answers, started looking for the seams in reality where the editing shows through. The chronofiles are real, the programs existed, the technology works, and somewhere in Nevada, in the ruins of a Cold War research facility, the evidence is waiting. I'm going to go find it, see you on the other side, or in another timeline, whichever comes first. What if the most powerful secret society in history wasn't the Illuminati, the Knights Templar, or even the modern Freemasons, but three men whose names have been deliberately erased from every record? Tonight, we dive deep into the digital shadows to uncover a conspiracy so intricate, so carefully hidden, that discovering it might be the last thing you ever do. Before we begin, what conspiracy would you like us to investigate next? Ancient bloodlines controlling world governments, the real purpose behind social media algorithms, or perhaps something even darker lurking in the depths of the internet? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to Sleep Theories for more late-night investigations that will keep you awake long after the credits roll. The blue glow of Dorian Cade's monitors cast long shadows across his cluttered apartment at 3:47 a.m. Empty energy drink cans formed a metallic skyline around his workstation, where 4 screens displayed cascading lines of encrypted data. This was his domain, the digital underworld where secrets lived and died in streams of code. Dorian had always been drawn to the spaces between spaces, the forgotten corners of the internet where truth hid behind layers of encryption. By day, he was just another cybersecurity analyst for Titan Defense Systems, debugging firewalls and hunting malware. But by night, he was something else entirely, a digital archaeologist, excavating buried information from the deepest recesses of the web. Tonight's target was a seemingly innocuous file archive he'd discovered on a defunct server that once belonged to the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania. The files were old, some dating back to the early digitization efforts of the 1990s, when historical documents were first being converted from physical to digital formats. Most of it was mundane: meeting minutes, membership rolls, financial records, the kind of material that would put most people to sleep. But Dorian wasn't most people. As his decryption algorithms worked through the data, something unusual caught his attention. Buried within a folder labelled Historical Correspondence MISC was a file that didn't match the others. The metadata was wrong, the encryption was different, and when he finally cracked it open, what he found made his pulse quicken. It was a single image, a symbol he had never seen before. 3 interlocked triangles formed an intricate pattern that seemed to shift and move in his peripheral vision. Each triangle was perfectly equilateral, but where they intersected, strange geometric forms emerged, creating an optical illusion that was both mesmerizing and unsettling. Beneath the symbol was a single line of text, the triune accord established. 1717 AVCRJH. Dorian leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming against his desk. 1717. That was the same year the Grand Lodge of London was established, marking the beginning of organised Freemasonry. But what was the Triune Accord, and who were AV, CR and JH? He screenshotted the image and began reverse searching it through every database he could access. Nothing. No matches, no similar images, no references anywhere on the indexed internet. It was as if this symbol existed in a void, completely disconnected from the digital world. The mystery deepened when he examined the file's digital signature. According to the metadata, this document had been accessed and modified hundreds of times over the past 30 years, but always by anonymous users with no traceable digital footprints. Someone, or multiple someones, had been maintaining this file, keeping it alive in the digital space while ensuring it remained invisible to casual observers. Dorian's hands moved instinctively to his keyboard. He had found something that wasn't supposed to be found, touched something that wasn't supposed to be touched. And now, he couldn't let it go. The hunt had begun. 3 days of relentless searching had yielded fragments, tantalizing pieces of a puzzle that refused to come together. Dorian had barely slept, surviving on caffeine and the electric thrill of discovery. His apartment had transformed into a conspiracy theorist's dream, with printed documents taped to every available wall surface, and red string connecting seemingly random data points. The breakthrough came when he cross-referenced the initials AV, CR, and JH with historical Masonic records from the early 18th century. Traditional sources yielded nothing, But when he dug into the darker corners of academic databases, forgotten doctoral dissertations, obscure historical journals, private collections that had been digitized but never properly indexed, patterns began to emerge. In a 1987 thesis on esoteric influences in early American politics, he found a footnote referencing 3 mysterious benefactors who had allegedly provided funding for the construction of several early American government buildings. The author had dismissed the claims as unsubstantiated rumours, but had noted that the same 3 sets of initials appeared in financial records from Philadelphia, Boston and Charleston between 1720 and 1750. A deeper dive into banking archives from the period revealed something extraordinary. Dorian discovered a series of encrypted letters between European aristocrats and early American colonists, all revolving around something called the doctrine of quiet influence. The letters, written in a cipher that had taken him 2 full days to crack, described a methodology for guiding human behaviour through subtle manipulation of symbols, language, and social structures. But it was the names that made his blood run cold. The letters were signed with the same initials, AV, CR, and JH. According to the correspondence, these 3 men weren't just wealthy benefactors. They were the architects of a new form of power, one that didn't rely on armies or political office, but on the manipulation of human psychology itself. They had studied the old mystery schools, the ancient techniques of persuasion and control, and had adapted them for a new age. One letter, dated 1734, was particularly chilling. The masses believe they choose their own thoughts, their own desires, their own leaders. They do not understand that choice itself can be manufactured, shaped like clay in the hands of those who understand the deeper mechanics of the human mind. We 3 have laid the foundation stones. Future generations will build upon our work without ever knowing our names. Dorian printed out the letter and pinned it to his wall next to the symbol of the 3 interlocked triangles. The pattern was starting to make sense. These weren't just random geometric shapes. They were a visual representation of the 3 founders' methodology. Each triangle represented a different sphere of influence: political, economic, and cultural. Where they intersected, control was established. But who were they? The initials were all he had to go on, and despite hours of searching, he couldn't find any historical figures from the period whose names matched. It was as if they had been deliberately erased from the historical record. That's when he made his second major discovery. Hidden within the financial records was a reference to something called the Lodge of 3 Pillars, not an official Masonic lodge, but what appeared to be a secret organisation within the larger Masonic structure. The 3 pillars, according to the documents, were AV, CR, and JH themselves. Dorian's excitement was tempered by a growing sense of unease. He was uncovering something that had been buried for nearly 3 centuries, something that powerful people had gone to great lengths to hide. The deeper he dug, the more he realised that this wasn't just history. It was a blueprint, a framework that was still being used. As the sun rose over the city, casting golden light through his apartment windows, Dorian stared at the wall of evidence he had assembled. The 3 Masons, as he had begun calling them, had created more than just a secret society. They had engineered a system of control that evolved and adapted over centuries, invisible but omnipresent. And now he was beginning to understand how it worked. The realization hit Dorian like a physical blow as he sat in his favourite coffee shop, laptop open, surrounded by the mundane chatter of the morning commuters. He had been analysing media patterns for the past week, looking for connections to the doctrine of quiet influence, when the data suddenly cohered into a terrifying picture. It was everywhere. The 3 interlocked triangles, the symbol of the triune accord, weren't just hidden in dusty historical archives. They were embedded in the fabric of modern culture, disguised and abstracted but unmistakably present. Movie logos, corporate brands, architectural designs, even the layout of popular websites, all contained subtle variations of the 3 triangle pattern. Dorian's hand shook as he scrolled through his analysis. He had developed an algorithm to detect geometric patterns that matched the mathematical relationships inherent in the original symbol. The results were overwhelming. Major Hollywood studios, Fortune 500 companies, news networks and social media platforms all incorporated elements of the design into their visual identity. But it went deeper than logos and branding. The doctrine of quiet influence, as described in the 18th century letters, relied on three key principles: repetition, authority, and emotional resonance. Dorian began to see these principles reflected in everything from political campaigns to advertising strategies to social media algorithms. The coffee in his cup grew cold as he dove deeper into the pattern recognition data. Primetime television shows contained dialogue structures that followed specific linguistic patterns outlined in the historical documents. Popular songs used chord progressions and lyrical frameworks that aligned with the emotional manipulation techniques described in the letters. Even children's programming seemed to incorporate subliminal messaging systems derived from the Three Masons' psychological frameworks. The most disturbing discovery came when he analysed news broadcasts from the past decade. Major networks, regardless of their political orientation, used nearly identical linguistic structures when reporting on controversial topics. The language was designed to create emotional responses that bypassed rational analysis, exactly as the doctrine had prescribed. Dorian closed his laptop and walked home in a daze. His apartment felt different now, contaminated by the knowledge he carried. Every advertisement on the subway, every billboard along the street, every notification on his phone, they all looked different through the lens of what he now understood. That evening he began compiling a comprehensive digital archive of his findings. If what he suspected was true, if the Three Masons' influence had not only survived but thrived in the modern era, then someone needed to document it. He created encrypted backups of everything: the historical documents, his analysis algorithms, the pattern recognition data, his own notes and theories. As he worked, a new question haunted him. If the Three Masons had successfully embedded their control systems into modern society, who was running those systems now? The original architects had died centuries ago, but their work lived on. Someone was maintaining it, updating it, ensuring its continued effectiveness. Dorian pulled up recent financial records from some of the corporations that featured the strongest pattern matches. Shell companies, offshore accounts, anonymous investors. The ownership structures were labyrinthine, designed to obscure rather than reveal. But patterns emerged here too. The same investment firms appeared again and again, the same legal structures, the same carefully anonymized board members. It was a network, vast and interconnected, spanning industries and continents, and at its heart Dorian was beginning to suspect were the modern inheritors of the Three Masons' legacy. He named his archive the Veil Project and began preparing it for release. The world had a right to know about the invisible architecture of influence that shaped their daily lives, but as he prepared to upload his findings to multiple whistleblower platforms, his computer screen flickered. For just a moment, the three interlocked triangles appeared in the corner of his monitor. There and gone so quickly he almost convinced himself he had imagined it. Almost. The message appeared in Dorian's private encrypted chat channel at 2:33 a.m, exactly 72 hours after he had discovered the pattern recognition data. The sender was listed as anonymous, but the message itself was anything but anonymous. It was clearly directed at him, containing details that only someone who had been watching his research could know. The three still watch. Stop now, Dorian. Dorian stared at the screen, his heart pounding. He had been so careful, using multiple layers of encryption, routing his traffic through a dozen different proxy servers, maintaining operational security that should have made him invisible to all but the most sophisticated surveillance operations. But they had found him. He ran a full system scan, checking for malware, backdoors, any sign of compromise. His security software came back clean, but Dorian knew that meant nothing. If someone had the resources to track his research, despite his precautions, they would also have the resources to hide their presence on his system. The paranoia began slowly, like a low-grade fever. Every notification on his phone made him jump. Every knock on his apartment door sent adrenaline coursing through his veins. He started noticing things that might have been coincidences. The same car parked outside his building for 3 days, a man in a coffee shop who looked away too quickly when Dorian glanced in his direction. The second message arrived 48 hours later, this time containing a photograph. It showed Dorian sitting at his computer, taken from inside his own apartment. The timestamp indicated it had been captured the previous night while he worked on the Veil project. Someone had been inside his home. Dorian immediately conducted a physical sweep of his apartment. He found the device hidden inside the frame of his bedroom mirror. A microcamera so small he almost missed it, connected to a transmitter that was broadcasting his every move to an unknown receiver. But the camera was just the beginning. A more thorough search revealed audio pickups in his kitchen and living room, keystroke loggers attached to his computer equipment, and something that looked like a network tap spliced into his Ethernet cable. His entire life was being monitored. The rational part of his mind told him to stop, to destroy his research and return to his normal life. But Dorian had never been particularly rational. The invasion of his privacy, rather than deterring him, only confirmed that he was onto something significant. You didn't deploy military-grade surveillance equipment against someone who was chasing shadows. He began operating under the assumption that everything he did was being watched. He established new research protocols, using air-gapped computers and physical storage devices that never connected to the internet. He moved his most sensitive work to a storage unit across town, accessible only by physical key. He varied his routines, took different routes to work, paid for everything in cash, but the watchers adapted too. His work computer at Titan Defense Systems began experiencing mysterious glitches. Files would disappear and reappear. His security clearance was subjected to routine reviews that felt anything but routine. Colleagues who had been friendly for years suddenly seemed distant, their conversations stilted and careful. The third message was different. Instead of a text, he received a link to a news article about a cybersecurity researcher in Seattle who had died in a car accident. The researcher, according to the article, had been working on sensitive projects related to digital privacy and surveillance. The accident had occurred at 3:17 a.m. on a straight stretch of highway, with no other vehicles involved. Dorian noticed that the timestamp on the article was exactly 3 minutes before he received the link. The message was clear: this could happen to you. But by then, Dorian was too deep to surface. The Veil project had expanded beyond his original scope, becoming an obsession that consumed his waking hours and invaded his dreams. He had uncovered something that went beyond historical curiosity or academic research. The Three Masons weren't just a fascinating historical footnote, they were the architects of a system that was still actively shaping human society. And someone was willing to kill to keep that secret hidden. That night, Dorian made a decision that would change everything. If they wanted to silence him, they would have to find him first. He began preparations for what he called Project Deep Dive, a final comprehensive investigation that would either expose the truth about the Three Masons or confirm his own paranoid delusions. Either way, he would have his answer. As he packed his research materials and prepared to disappear into the digital underground, Dorian caught a glimpse of his reflection in the bathroom mirror. He looked like a man who had seen too much, learned too much, gone too far down a rabbit hole that might not have an exit. But he also looked like a man who was finally fully alive. The abandoned subway station beneath downtown had been closed since 1962, but Dorian's research had revealed that its tunnels connected to a network of service corridors that ran beneath several government buildings. More importantly, the location offered something he desperately needed: complete isolation from digital surveillance. He had spent 3 days preparing his mobile command center. Military-grade Faraday cages protected his equipment from electronic monitoring. Satellite internet connections routed through multiple international proxies provided connectivity that would be nearly impossible to trace. Battery packs and portable generators ensured he could operate for weeks without external power. The setup looked like something out of a post-apocalyptic thriller, and Dorian couldn't shake the feeling that it might represent his future. A life spent in the shadows, hunted by forces he barely understood. But it was here, in the depths beneath the city that he finally breached what he had come to think of as the vault. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While analysing the financial networks he had discovered, Dorian noticed that several key transactions were processed through a server cluster housed in the Smithsonian Institution's digital archive facility. The Smithsonian servers weren't just repositories for historical documents. They were hosting active financial systems for the network of corporations connected to the Three Masons pattern. Using exploit tools from his defence contractor days, Dorian tunnelled into the archive system through a maintenance portal that had been forgotten during a security update. What he found inside defied his wildest expectations. The vault wasn't a single database, it was an entire hidden internet, a shadow network that existed parallel to the visible web. Accessible only through specific cryptographic keys that appeared to be distributed to a select group of users, the vault contained terabytes of data spanning 3 centuries. The most recent files were mind-bending. Detailed psychological profiles of world leaders, media manipulation strategies updated in real time, algorithmic frameworks for managing public opinion through social media platforms. But it was the historical archives that truly shocked him. Digitized manuscripts described secret chambers beneath Washington, D.C., built during the Capitol's construction according to specifications provided by the Three Masons. The chambers weren't just meeting spaces. They were designed as psychological amplification devices, using acoustic engineering and symbolic geometry to enhance the persuasive power of those who spoke within them. Architectural drawings showed that the entire layout of the Capitol building, the White House, and the Supreme Court formed a massive version of the 3 interlocked triangles when viewed from above. The buildings weren't just symbols of American democracy. They were active components in a system designed to channel and focus political influence. But the most disturbing documents dealt with something called the Great Work, an ongoing project to gradually reshape human consciousness through systematic manipulation of culture, education, and information systems. The Great Work wasn't a conspiracy in the traditional sense. It was presented as a form of guided evolution, helping humanity develop according to principles established by the Three Masons. According to the documents, every major social movement of the past 2 centuries had been either initiated or co-opted by the inheritors of the Three Masons' legacy. Wars, revolutions, technological breakthroughs, cultural shifts, all were pieces in a vast game being played by invisible hands. And Dorian discovered that modern political speeches were crafted using linguistic frameworks, derived directly from the original doctrine of quiet influence. Presidential debates, congressional hearings, Supreme Court arguments, all followed scripted patterns designed to produce predetermined emotional responses in viewers. Entertainment media was even more thoroughly controlled. Hollywood studios, record labels, publishing houses, all were connected to the network through complex ownership structures. Popular culture wasn't a reflection of society's values. It was a tool for shaping those values. As Dorian delved deeper into the vault, he began to understand the true scope of what he was facing. This wasn't just a historical conspiracy. It was a living system, constantly evolving and adapting to new technologies and social conditions. The Three Masons had died centuries ago, but their work lived on through institutions, traditions, and methodologies that had become so embedded in society that they were virtually invisible. The most chilling realization came when he discovered his own file in the vault's database. They had been monitoring him for months, tracking his research, analysing his psychological profile, preparing countermeasures. His investigation hadn't been a secret quest for truth. It had been a carefully observed experiment. But why let him discover so much? Why allow him to penetrate their most sensitive archives? The answer came in a document titled Protocol 7, Asset Integration. Dorian's blood ran cold as he read the clinical assessment of his psychological profile, his motivations, his likely responses to various stimuli. He wasn't just a threat to be eliminated. He was a potential asset to be recruited. The file indicated that his research skills and psychological profile made him an ideal candidate for voluntary integration into their network. His investigation of the Three Masons hadn't been a violation of their security. It had been an audition. As this understanding washed over him, Dorian noticed something that made his hands shake. The documents he was accessing contained metadata signatures, hidden markers that traced every query back to his specific location and identity. By exploring the vault, he wasn't just learning their secrets, he was leaving digital fingerprints that proved he had been there. The final piece of the puzzle revealed itself at 4:47 a.m. on what Dorian would later realise was his last night of freedom. He had been analysing the most recent uploads to the vault, real-time data feeds that showed the Three Masons influence network in active operation. What he discovered was breathtaking in its scope and terrifying in its implications. The network wasn't just influencing culture and politics, it was actively shaping reality itself through coordinated manipulation of information systems. Social media algorithms were tweaked to promote specific narratives. Search engine results were subtly adjusted to guide public research toward predetermined conclusions. News recommendation systems were programmed to create echo chambers that reinforced desired belief patterns. But the most sophisticated element was something they called consensus engineering. By carefully managing the flow of information across multiple platforms simultaneously, the network could create the illusion that certain ideas were organically emerging from grassroots movements, when in fact they were being systematically planted and cultivated. Dorian watched in real time as a coordinated information campaign was launched across dozens of platforms. A political controversy that would dominate news cycles for weeks was being artificially created through carefully timed leaks, strategic social media posts, and coordinated commentary from influencers who probably didn't even realise they were part of the operation. The level of coordination was staggering. Television networks, newspapers, social media platforms, and even individual bloggers were all receiving talking points through channels that appeared unconnected but were actually part of a single centralised command structure. He began documenting everything, screenshotting real-time operations, copying database entries, building an irrefutable record of the network in action. This was the smoking gun he had been looking for, proof that modern society was being manipulated by invisible forces operating on a scale that dwarfed anything in history. But as he prepared to copy the most damaging files to his secure storage devices, Dorian noticed something that made his blood freeze. The documents he was accessing contained more than just information. They contained active code that was executing on his system every time he opened a file. He ran an immediate diagnostic and discovered the horrifying truth. Every document in the vault was embedded with sophisticated tracking malware. Not only did the system know exactly what he had accessed, it had been installing backdoors and surveillance tools on his equipment from the moment he had first breached their security. His air-gapped computers weren't air-gapped anymore. His encrypted storage devices were compromised. His Faraday cages were useless against software that was already inside his systems. But the worst revelation was yet to come. As he traced the malware's network connections, Dorian realised that his entire investigation had been orchestrated from the beginning. The original files he had discovered in the Masonic Lodge archive. They had been placed there deliberately, designed to attract someone with his specific skill set and psychological profile. The research trails he had followed, the connections he had discovered, the patterns he had uncovered, all of it had been a carefully constructed puzzle, leading him step by step to this moment. He hadn't been investigating the Three Masons, he had been recruited by them. The recruitment wasn't complete yet. According to the protocols he found in his own file, the final step required a conscious choice. He could accept integration into their network, becoming a willing participant in the great work, or he could face the consequences of possessing knowledge that wasn't meant for outsiders. As if summoned by his thoughts, a new message appeared on his screen. Dorian, you have seen behind the veil. There are only two paths forward. Choose wisely. Below the message were two links. The first was labelled Integration. The second was labelled Termination. Dorian stared at the screen, his mind racing through the implications of everything he had discovered. The Three Masons weren't the villains in this story, at least not from their perspective. They saw themselves as shepherds of human civilization, guiding society toward what they believed was a better future. The manipulation, the control, the systematic shaping of human consciousness, all of it was presented as necessary stewardship of a species too chaotic and self-destructive to govern itself effectively. But Dorian couldn't shake the image of humanity as a vast puppet show, with invisible hands pulling strings that the puppets couldn't even see. Was guided evolution really better than free will? Was managed consciousness preferable to authentic chaos? The choice before him wasn't just about his own survival. It was about what kind of world he wanted to live in, and what kind of person he wanted to be within that world. As he reached for his mouse to make his selection, Dorian heard something that made his blood run cold. Sirens in the distance, growing closer. Time was up. The sound of footsteps in the tunnel above was unmistakable. Heavy boots, moving with military precision, getting closer with each passing second. Dorian's hands flew across his keyboard as he initiated emergency protocols, wiping drives, destroying evidence, preparing for what he now realized was inevitable. The sirens had been a psychological prompt designed to create urgency and force a hasty decision. The real trap was much more elegant than simple law enforcement intervention. As Dorian frantically tried to secure his data, he discovered that his internet connection had been severed, not blocked, completely terminated at the infrastructure level. His backup satellite connections were jammed. His cellular network showed full signal strength but couldn't establish data connections. Even his emergency radio beacon was transmitting into empty air, its signals absorbed by sophisticated countermeasures he couldn't detect, but could feel pressing in around him like invisible walls. The isolation was complete and professional. Whoever was coming for him had surrounded him not just physically, but digitally, cutting off every possible avenue of communication or escape. But Dorian had one final card to play. Before establishing his underground command centre, he had prepared a dead man's switch, an automated system that would release his entire archive if he failed to check in within a specific time window. The system was housed on a server cluster in Eastern Europe, completely disconnected from his current location and impossible to trace back to him through conventional means. At least that's what he had believed. As he tried to access the dead man's switch, Dorian discovered that it too had been compromised. The activation codes had been changed, the server locations had been altered, and his backup authentication systems had been systematically disabled. Somehow they had anticipated and countered even his most paranoid contingency plans. The footsteps stopped directly above his hiding place. In the silence that followed, Dorian finally understood the true nature of the trap. He hadn't just been recruited, he had been studied, analysed, and predicted with mechanical precision. Every move he had made, every precaution he had taken, every paranoid contingency he had prepared, had been anticipated and accounted for. His investigation hadn't been a threat to their operations, it had been a demonstration of their capabilities. A voice echoed down from the tunnel above, calm and professional. "Mr. Cade, we need to talk." Dorian looked around his underground command centre. The sophisticated equipment, the military-grade security measures, the careful preparations that had taken weeks to implement. All of it was useless now. He had been allowed to build this fortress so that they could demonstrate how easily it could be bypassed. The voice continued, "Your research has been impressive. Your skills are exactly what we've been looking for. But the recruitment process needs to be completed according to protocol." Protocol. Everything with them was protocol, systematic and methodical. Even rebellion had to follow their rules, serve their purposes, advance their agenda. As the first figures began descending into his underground sanctuary, Dorian made one final desperate attempt to access his archive. If he could just upload something, anything, to prove that the three Masons were real and active, maybe someone else would continue the investigation. But his screens had already gone dark. His equipment was shutting down in sequence, responding to override commands that bypassed every security system he had installed. They weren't just capturing him, they were demonstrating complete dominance over his digital domain. The lead figure removed their helmet, revealing a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a patient smile. She looked more like a librarian than a Black Ops operative. but her presence commanded the attention of everyone in the room. "Hello, Dorian," she said warmly. "My name is Dr. Ellen Drew, and I represent the contemporary stewards of the great work. You've impressed us greatly with your research, but I'm afraid you've also created a security situation that needs to be resolved." Dorian found his voice. "You mean eliminated?" Dr. Drew shook her head. "Integration, actually. Your psychological profile suggests you'd be much more valuable as a willing participant than as a cautionary tale. The choice is still yours, but I should mention that the termination option from earlier was never really on the table. We've invested too much in your development to waste that potential." As she spoke, Dorian realised that even his moment of apparent choice had been an illusion. The integration process had already begun the moment he first accessed their files. Every revelation, every discovery, every moment of apparent rebellion had been carefully orchestrated to bring him to this point. He wasn't being recruited, he was being harvested. Dr. Drew gestured to the equipment surrounding them. "All of this will be preserved, of course. Your research will continue, but with proper resources and institutional support. The Three Masons' work is too important to be left to individual initiative, no matter how talented." Dorian stared at the woman who held his future in her hands. "And if I refuse?" "Then you'll be experiencing a very realistic simulation of refusal, while your consciousness is gradually adjusted to accept integration. We've found that the illusion of choice makes the process more comfortable for everyone involved. The trap was perfect because it had no exit. Resistance would be futile because resistance was part of the design. Even this conversation, even his growing horror at the situation, was probably being factored into some psychological algorithm designed to optimize his eventual compliance." As the implication sank in, Dorian felt something break inside him. Not his spirit, but his attachment to the idea that any of this had ever been real. His investigation, his discoveries, his moment of revelation, all of it had been a carefully crafted performance designed to transform him into whatever they needed him to become. The Three Masons weren't just controlling society, they were controlling him. And the most terrifying part was that he was beginning to understand why. 6 months after Dorian Cade disappeared from his apartment in the middle of the night, fragments of his research began surfacing on obscure internet forums. Anonymous uploads appeared on file-sharing networks, containing encrypted archives that told a story of conspiracy and control spanning 3 centuries. The uploads were sporadic and seemingly random. A few documents here, some analysis there, portions of what appeared to be a larger investigation into something called the Three Masons. The files generated intense discussion in certain corners of the internet. Conspiracy theorists, digital privacy advocates, and researchers into esoteric history all found elements that resonated with their particular interests. But the fragments raised more questions than they answered. The documentation was sophisticated enough to suggest serious research, but incomplete enough to prevent any definitive conclusions. The historical elements were intriguingly plausible, but unverifiable through conventional sources. The contemporary analysis contained insights into media manipulation and social control that seemed prescient, but could easily be dismissed as paranoid speculation. Some investigators tried to trace the uploads back to their source, but the digital trails led nowhere. The files appeared and disappeared from servers around the world, uploaded by anonymous accounts that vanished as quickly as they had been created. Whoever was releasing this information had sophisticated technical capabilities and an intimate understanding of how to remain invisible in the digital landscape. The mystery deepened when researchers noticed that the archive fragments contained embedded metadata, hidden signatures that seemed to reference additional materials that had never been released. The signatures suggested that what they were seeing was only a small portion of a much larger collection of evidence. But where was the rest of the archive? And who was controlling its release? Theories proliferated across discussion forums and social media platforms. Some believed that Dorian Cade had been silenced by the very forces he was investigating, and that the leaked materials were being released by automated systems he had established as insurance. Others suggested that the entire thing was an elaborate alternate reality game, designed to blur the lines between fiction and reality. A few researchers claimed to have identified patterns in the release schedule, that aligned with significant political events or cultural developments. The fragments seemed to appear at moments when they would have maximum relevance to current affairs, as if someone was curating their release to maximise impact. But perhaps the most unsettling theory was that the leaks were intentional, not the work of a whistleblower or an automated system, but a deliberate information campaign designed to achieve some larger purpose. If the three Masons really existed, and if they really controlled information systems as thoroughly as the document suggested, then wouldn't they also control the narrative of their own exposure? Late-night researchers who delved too deeply into the Cade archive reported strange experiences, computer glitches that seemed too targeted to be random, internet searches that returned results that disappeared when accessed again, social media algorithms that seemed to actively suppress discussion of certain topics. Some claimed to have received anonymous messages warning them away from the investigation. Others reported that their research was being monitored by unknown parties. A few simply stopped posting one day, their accounts going silent without explanation. The pattern was subtle but consistent. Those who got closest to understanding the true scope of Dorian's discoveries seemed to encounter obstacles that discouraged further research. Nothing dramatic, nothing that couldn't be explained by coincidence or technical malfunction. But the cumulative effect was to ensure that the investigation never reached critical mass. And so the mystery of Dorian Cade and the three Masons remained unsolved, existing in the liminal space between truth and fiction, between revelation and misdirection. The fragments continued to circulate, generating discussion and debate, but never quite coalescing into anything that could definitively prove or disprove the central claims. The most dedicated researchers began to notice something peculiar about their own investigations. The deeper they dug, the more they found themselves questioning not just the truth of Dorian's discoveries, but the nature of truth itself. If information could be so thoroughly controlled and manipulated, how could anyone be certain that their own thoughts and conclusions were authentic? One researcher, posting under the username Digital Veil, claimed to have reconstructed portions of Dorian's methodology and arrived at similar conclusions about media manipulation and social control. But when other investigators tried to verify the research, they found that the evidence cited by Digital Veil led to websites that no longer existed, documents that had been removed from archives, and source materials that seemed to vanish whenever anyone tried to access them independently. Was Digital Veil continuing Dorian's work? Or was Digital Veil part of the very system Dorian had claimed to expose? The question became even more complex when Digital Veil began posting increasingly sophisticated analysis that seemed to predict social and political developments with uncanny accuracy. The posts described how specific news events would unfold, how public opinion would shift in response to carefully crafted messaging campaigns, and how seemingly unrelated cultural phenomena were actually coordinated elements of larger influence operations. And the predictions kept coming true. But rather than proving the existence of the Three Masons conspiracy, Digital Veil's accurate predictions only deepened the mystery. Were they based on genuine insider knowledge of how the system operated, or were they simply the result of careful observation of existing patterns? Was Digital Veil exposing the conspiracy or participating in it? The final post from Digital Veil came exactly 1 year after Dorian Cade's disappearance. It consisted of a single image, the three interlocked triangles that had started Dorian's investigation, accompanied by a brief message. The research continues. The watchers become the watched. The hunters become the hunted. Truth is not a destination but a journey, and some journeys are designed to change the traveller more than the destination. Dorian understood this in the end. He chose integration not because he was forced to, but because he realised that the only way to truly oppose the system was to understand it from within. The Three Masons were never the enemy. They were teachers, waiting for students ready to learn the hardest lesson of all. Power is not something you take. Power is something you become. The archive is complete, the circle is closed, the great work continues. DK. The message sparked intense debate across conspiracy forums and research communities. Was this really from Dorian Cade, suggesting that he had willingly joined the organisation he'd been investigating? Was it a fake message designed to discredit his research? Or was it something more subtle, a coded communication from someone operating deep within the system Dorian had tried to expose? No one could agree on the interpretation, and perhaps that was the point. The message was designed to be ambiguous, to raise questions rather than answer them, to ensure that the investigation would continue but never reach a definitive conclusion. In the months that followed, the Dorian Cade archive gradually faded from active discussion. New conspiracy theories emerged to capture the attention of digital investigators. New mysteries arose to challenge those who sought hidden truths. The three Masons, if they existed, returned to the shadows where they had always operated most effectively. But for those who had followed the investigation closely, something had changed. They found themselves looking at the world differently, noticing patterns they had never seen before, questioning assumptions they had never thought to examine. They began to see the invisible architecture of influence that shaped their daily lives, even if they couldn't prove its existence to others. Some researchers reported that they had begun to incorporate elements of the doctrine of quiet influence into their own work, not to manipulate others, but to better understand how they themselves were being manipulated. They studied the psychological techniques described in Dorian's files, the linguistic frameworks, the symbolic systems, the methodologies for shaping human consciousness. A few claim to have achieved a kind of immunity to mass manipulation through this understanding. They described a state of hyper-awareness where they could observe the influence systems operating around them without being affected by them. They called it seeing through the veil. But others wondered if this supposed immunity was itself an illusion, if the system was sophisticated enough to make people believe they had escaped its influence, while actually drawing them deeper into its web. After all, what better way to control someone than to convince them they couldn't be controlled? The question that haunted all serious researchers into the Dorian Cade mystery was whether the investigation had revealed the truth about hidden systems of control, or whether it had been a demonstration of those systems in action. Had they uncovered a conspiracy, or had they been recruited into one? Perhaps the most unsettling possibility was that there was no meaningful difference between the two options. The final entry in what researchers believed to be Dorian's original archive was a single text file, uploaded anonymously to a dozen different platforms simultaneously. It contained no metadata, no digital signatures, no clues about its origin. The message was brief but haunting. If you are reading this, you have already been chosen. The investigation never ends. It only changes investigators. Welcome to the great work. Your orientation will begin shortly. Below the message was a simple instruction. Look around you. Really look. The signs are everywhere, once you know how to see them. And indeed, those who followed the instruction began to notice things. Symbols in corporate logos that matched patterns from the historical documents. Linguistic structures in news broadcasts that aligned with psychological manipulation frameworks. Social media algorithms that seemed to nudge users towards specific conclusions without their awareness. The three Masons weren't hiding in the shadows. They were hiding in plain sight, their influence so thoroughly woven into the fabric of modern society that it had become invisible through ubiquity. They didn't need to silence investigators because they had created a world where the truth was indistinguishable from elaborate fiction. And perhaps that was the most elegant control system of all. A reality so thoroughly constructed that even those who glimpsed behind the veil couldn't be certain whether they had discovered the truth or been recruited to perpetuate a more sophisticated illusion. The three Masons, whether real or imagined, ancient or contemporary, had achieved something unprecedented in human history. They had made the question of their existence irrelevant. In a world where information could be infinitely manipulated and human consciousness systematically shaped, the distinction between reality and carefully crafted narrative had ceased to matter. What mattered was the system itself, the vast, invisible architecture of influence that operated according to principles established centuries ago by three men whose names had been deliberately erased from history. They had created not just a secret society, but a new form of reality, one where truth was not discovered but constructed, where power was not seized but evolved, and where the ultimate conspiracy was the idea that conspiracies were necessary at all. In the end, Dorian Cade's investigation had revealed something far more profound than evidence of historical manipulation or contemporary control systems. It had revealed the fundamental malleability of human consciousness and the terrifying possibility that reality itself was subject to editing by those who understood the deeper mechanics of perception and belief. The three were not just in the past, they were here now, watching, guiding, shaping the very thoughts that their observers used to contemplate their existence. They had transcended the crude mechanics of conspiracy to achieve something approaching digital godhood, the power to define reality itself. And the most beautiful part of their design was that it didn't matter whether anyone believed in them or not. The system they had created was self-sustaining, self-correcting, and ultimately inescapable. The investigation was over. The great work continued, and somewhere in the space between digital shadows and physical reality, Dorian Cade smiled and began planning his next recruitment. Imagine discovering that your government has been lying to you about the greatest threat humanity has ever faced. Imagine learning that while officials tell you everything is normal, they've been secretly building underground cities for themselves and their families. Imagine realizing that 300 million Americans have been marked as acceptable losses in a disaster that's not a matter of if, but when. This is a story based on real geological science, actual government protocols, and the terrifying possibility that the truth about Yellowstone is being hidden from you right now. What happens when the greatest natural disaster in human history has been predicted, planned for, and hidden from the public? When a junior geologist stumbles upon evidence that the Yellowstone supervolcano isn't dormant, it's being managed. He discovers that some truths are worth killing for. Special thanks to Nicola for this incredible story concept and detailed research that made this narrative possible. Yellowstone National Park Monitoring Station, October the 15th, 2014. The coffee had gone cold hours ago, but Eli Grant barely noticed. His eyes were locked on the seismic readout scrolling across his monitor, watching patterns that shouldn't exist dance across the screen like digital ghosts. At 24, fresh out of graduate school with a geology degree from Colorado State, Eli had spent the last 3 months as a USGS intern learning that monitoring America's most dangerous supervolcano was mostly routine data collection, punctuated by moments of sheer terror. This was one of those moments. The microquakes were coming from depths that made his stomach turn. 15 miles down, deeper than any recorded activity in Yellowstone's 30-year digital monitoring history. The frequency was wrong too, clustered in tight bursts rather than the random scatter typical of normal geothermal activity. Each tremor registered between 1.2 and 1.8 on the Richter scale, small enough to be dismissed individually, but together they painted a picture that made Eli's hands shake as he reached for his phone. Before he could dial his supervisor, the screen flickered. The anomalous readings vanished, replaced by a steady green line indicating normal background activity. A automated message popped up. Calibration complete. Data archived. Eli stared at the empty screen, 15 minutes of unprecedented deep seismic activity had just been erased as if it never existed. He quickly navigated to the backup servers, his fingers flying across the keyboard with increasing desperation. The raw data files were gone. The automated alerts had been cleared. Even the emergency notification logs showed nothing but routine system maintenance. "Working late again, kid?" Eli spun around to find Karen Holt standing in the doorway, her park ranger uniform still crisp despite the late hour. At 52, Karen had been patrolling Yellowstone's backcountry for over 2 decades, and her weathered face carried the kind of knowledge that came from watching the park's moods change with the seasons. "Karen, did you feel anything about an hour ago? Any tremors?" She studied his face carefully before stepping into the room and closing the door behind her. "You saw something on the monitors?" "Deep quakes, deeper than anything in the database, but they're gone now, scrubbed clean like they never happened." Karen was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the sanitized readouts. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight Eli had never heard before. "How long have you been working here, Eli?" 3 months. "Long enough to know what you're looking at, not long enough to know what you're not supposed to see." She pulled up a chair beside him. "Let me ask you something. You know why they put the monitoring station here instead of closer to the caldera?" Eli shrugged. "Better communication links, I assumed. Easier access for maintenance." "That's what they tell the interns." Karen's fingers drummed against the desk. "The real reason is that certain types of data collection work better from a distance. Gives you time to curate what goes into the public record." The implication hit Eli like a physical blow. "Are you saying they're hiding seismic data?" "I'm saying that 23 years of watching this place has taught me that Yellowstone keeps secrets, and some people are very invested in keeping those secrets buried." She stood up, her hand resting briefly on his shoulder. "Don't start asking questions you're not ready to answer, Eli. This park isn't just about geysers." After she left, Eli sat alone in the monitoring station, staring at the clean, normal readouts. But Karen's warning had sparked something dangerous. Curiosity. He pulled up the archived database and began searching for gaps, periods where data might have been scrubbed before. What he found made his pulse quicken. Small deletions in 2009, 2004, and 1997. Always deep seismic activity. Always erased within hours of being recorded. Always during periods when public attention was focused elsewhere. Economic crashes, natural disasters, political scandals. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental. Eli spent the rest of the night copying every piece of raw data he could access onto external drives, working with the methodical precision of someone who understood that some opportunities only came once. By dawn, he had assembled a fragmentary picture of Yellowstone's hidden activity dating back 15 years. The supervolcano wasn't dormant. It was being watched, monitored, and most importantly hidden from public view. As the sun rose over the Yellowstone River, Eli Grant became the first person outside the conspiracy to see the full scope of what was coming. What he didn't know was that his discovery had already been noted by systems designed to catch exactly this kind of unauthorized access. In a secure facility 300 miles away, automated alerts were already being generated, and decisions were being made about what to do with a curious young geologist who had seen too much. Chapter 1. The Official Story. Yellowstone National Park Headquarters, March 22nd, 2015. The press briefing room was packed with reporters from every major network, their cameras trained on the panel of scientists seated behind a table adorned with official USGS and National Park Service seals. Outside, early spring snow dusted the peaks surrounding Mammoth Hot Springs, but inside the room, the atmosphere was warm with the heat of television lights and simmering questions about Yellowstone's recent activity. Eli stood at the back of the room, his USGS badge giving him access to the media event despite his junior status. In the 5 months since he'd first witnessed the data scrubbing, he'd kept his head down and his mouth shut, but he'd also kept watching. The patterns were becoming clearer and more disturbing with each passing week. Chief Park Scientist Janet Morrison stepped up to the microphone, her grey hair pulled back in a severe bun that matched her no-nonsense expression. "Good morning. I want to address the speculation that's been circulating online regarding recent seismic activity in Yellowstone National Park." Eli noticed how she avoided mentioning the source of that speculation, a viral video showing hundreds of elk and bison streaming out of the Lamar Valley in what appeared to be a coordinated exodus. The footage had been taken by a tourist 3 weeks earlier and had garnered over 2 million views before park officials managed to provide alternative explanations. "Based on our continuous monitoring of the Yellowstone volcanic system," Morrison continued, "I can state categorically that no eruption is imminent. The seismic activity recorded over the past month falls well within normal parameters for this geologically active region." A reporter from CNN raised her hand. "But what about the animal migrations? Local ranchers are reporting unusual behaviour in wildlife populations. Seasonal migration patterns can vary significantly based on weather conditions, food availability, and natural population cycles," Morrison replied smoothly. "What some observers have interpreted as unusual behaviour is actually quite normal for this time of year." Eli bit back the urge to laugh. He'd seen the internal memos describing the animal movements as unprecedented and potentially indicative of subsurface environmental changes. The scientists on this panel knew exactly what was causing the animals to flee, but they were standing in front of cameras and lying about it with practiced ease. The questions continued for another 20 minutes, each one deflected with rehearsed responses that provided just enough technical detail to sound authoritative while revealing absolutely nothing of substance. As the briefing ended and reporters filed out, Eli lingered near the back of the room, watching the scientists pack up their materials. Impressive performance. Eli turned to find a man in his 40s wearing a FEMA windbreaker, his identification badge hanging from a lanyard around his neck. Deputy Director Marcus Webb, according to the credential. "I'm sorry?" "The briefing. Very professional. Of course, the real challenge isn't managing the press, it's managing the logistics." Webb's smile was friendly, but his eyes remained cold. "You're Eli Grant, aren't you?" The intern who's been asking interesting questions. Eli's mouth went dry. "I don't know what you mean." "Database queries at odd hours, unusual download activity, IT security flags that kind of behaviour automatically." Webb stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Don't worry. Curiosity is natural in your line of work, but there are some areas where curiosity can become problematic." "Are you threatening me?" "I'm offering advice. FEMA has been conducting training exercises in this region for several months now. Interagency coordination, emergency response protocols, that sort of thing. You might have noticed our vehicles around the park." Eli had noticed. Black SUVs and unmarked trucks had been appearing at various locations throughout Yellowstone, always accompanied by personnel who claimed to be conducting routine training exercises. The timing seemed suspicious. Why increase emergency preparedness training just as seismic activity was being actively suppressed from public records? "What kind of training?" Webb's smile widened. "Zone 5 evacuation protocols. Very comprehensive. Very necessary." He handed Eli a business card. "If you ever want to know more about emergency preparedness, give me a call. But remember, some knowledge comes with responsibilities." After Webb walked away, Eli stood alone in the empty briefing room, turning the card over in his hands. Zone 5 evacuation protocols. He'd never heard the term before, despite his security clearance and access to most FEMA documentation. That night, he spent hours searching through official databases, finding references to Zones 1 through 4, but nothing about Zone 5. Whatever Webb was talking about, it existed outside the normal chain of command and public accountability. The realization sent a chill down Eli's spine that had nothing to do with the late spring snow falling outside his apartment window. 3 days later, Karen Holt found him in the monitoring station, hunched over his computer with the intensity of someone racing against time. "You're digging deeper," she observed, not bothering to make it a question. "Someone has to." They're lying to everyone, Karen. The seismic data, the animal behaviour, the FEMA exercises, none of it adds up to the story they're telling the public. Karen closed the door and activated the white noise generator that was supposedly used to prevent electronic eavesdropping during sensitive conferences. What do you know about the Deep Bore project? Never heard of it. Officially, it never existed. Unofficially, it was a joint USGS military operation that ran from 2008 to 2012. The cover story was installation of advanced seismic monitoring equipment in previously inaccessible areas of the park. And the real story? Pressure venting? They were drilling down to the magma chamber and installing systems designed to release pressure in controlled amounts, potentially delaying or preventing a catastrophic eruption. Eli stared at her. That's actually brilliant. Why would they hide something like that? Because it didn't work. The magma chamber is too large, too unstable. The venting systems were supposed to buy us decades. Instead, they may have accelerated the timeline. Karen's face was grim. One of the contractors died during the installation phase. Officially, it was an industrial accident. Unofficially, he was murdered to prevent him from talking about what he'd discovered down there. What did he discover? That the eruption isn't a matter of if, Eli. It's a matter of when. And when is a lot sooner than anyone is willing to admit publicly. As Karen left him alone with this revelation, Eli found himself staring at the sanitized seismic readouts with new understanding. The data scrubbing wasn't just about hiding Yellowstone's activity from the public. It was about hiding the failure of a desperate attempt to prevent the greatest natural disaster in human history. And somewhere, people with access to the real data were making plans that didn't include the 300 million Americans living in the path of destruction. Chapter 2. The Elite Plan. USGS Regional Office, Denver, September 14, 2016. The security badge scanner beeped as Eli swiped his credential, granting him access to the restricted archives beneath the Denver Federal Building. 18 months had passed since his first glimpse of the conspiracy, and his official duties had gradually shifted from basic monitoring to special projects, a euphemism for working on data sets that required higher security clearances and absolute discretion. What his supervisors didn't know was that Eli had been using his expanded access to piece together a puzzle that grew more terrifying with each new fragment of information he uncovered. The file he'd been looking for was buried in a section marked HLT 2030, nestled between routine geological surveys and budget projections for monitoring equipment. Hazard level threshold 2030. The designation meant nothing to most people, but Eli had learned to recognize the bureaucratic camouflage used to hide the most sensitive documents. He opened the file with trembling fingers. The first page was a summary that made his vision blur. Probabilistic eruption window, 2028 to 2032. Confidence interval, 94.7%. Recommended public disclosure timeline, none. Eli had to read the last line 3 times before its meaning sank in. They had narrowed down the eruption timeline to a 4-year window with near certainty, and the official recommendation was to tell the public nothing. The next section detailed evacuation protocols that divided the American population into 2 distinct categories. Tier 1 included federal government personnel, military leadership, critical infrastructure managers, and selected scientific and medical professionals, approximately 2.3 million people, who would receive advance warning and priority evacuation to designated safe zones. Tier 2 encompassed everyone else, 327 million Americans whose evacuation status was listed with brutal honesty as no viable plan. Eli scrolled through page after page of logistical nightmares and resource calculations. The ash fallout zone would render most of the continental United States uninhabitable for years. The immediate kill zone, a radius of approximately 700 miles from the eruption site, would experience pyroclastic flows, toxic gas emissions, and complete ecological collapse. Even with advance warning, there weren't enough resources to evacuate more than a fraction of the affected population. But the most damning section came toward the end. cross-reference construction projects that had been authorized and funded over the past decade. Underground facilities in Colorado, Utah, and South Dakota, officially described as continuity of government installations or strategic resource storage sites. The locations formed a clear pattern, far enough from Yellowstone to avoid the immediate devastation, supplied with independent power and air filtration systems, and sized to accommodate the Tier 1 population for extended periods. None of the facilities were located in Wyoming or Montana, the states that would bear the brunt of the initial eruption. The people living in those areas, including Eli himself, were considered acceptable losses. A sound in the corridor outside made Eli freeze. Footsteps were approaching the archive room, accompanied by the low murmur of voices. He quickly photographed the most critical pages with his phone, replaced the file, and pretended to be reviewing mundane seismic reports. The door opened to reveal Deputy Director Webb and a woman Eli didn't recognize, both wearing the kind of serious expressions that accompanied discussions of national security. "Grant," Webb nodded, "working late again, I see." "Just catching up on some routine analysis," Eli replied, hoping his voice sounded steadier than he felt. The woman studied him with interest. "You're the intern who's been flagged for unusual database access patterns. I prefer to think of myself as thorough." Webb laughed, but the sound held no humour. "Thoroughness is admirable. Discretion is essential. I trust you understand the distinction." After they left, Eli sat alone in the archive room, staring at the photos on his phone. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. A small group of government officials and scientists had known for years that Yellowstone was approaching a catastrophic eruption, and their response had been to save themselves while leaving everyone else to die. The scope of the betrayal was breathtaking. Hundreds of millions of people were going about their daily lives, making plans for the future, raising children and building careers, completely unaware that their government had already written them off as collateral damage in a disaster that could be predicted but not prevented. That night, Eli returned to his apartment in Gardner, Montana, with the decision crystallizing in his mind. The evidence he'd gathered was enough to expose the conspiracy, but he needed more. Documentation that would be impossible to dismiss or discredit. He also needed a way to get the information to journalists who couldn't be intimidated or bought off. What he didn't know was that his activities in the archive had been monitored in real time, and that his phone's camera had triggered security algorithms designed to detect unauthorized photography of classified documents. By the time he fell asleep that night, plans were already being made to ensure that Eli Grant's investigation would end before it could threaten the carefully constructed wall of silence surrounding Yellowstone's deadly secret. Chapter 3. The Suppression. Gardner, Montana, November the 8th, 2016. Eli's apartment had been turned upside down with surgical precision. Furniture overturned, drawers pulled out and dumped, every electronic device missing or destroyed. But the most telling detail was what the intruders hadn't done. They'd left his television, his expensive hiking equipment, and the cash he kept in a kitchen drawer. This wasn't a random burglary. Someone had been looking for specific items and they'd found them. His laptop was gone. His external hard drives were missing. Even his backup thumb drives, hidden in a hollowed-out book, had been discovered and taken. Months of carefully gathered evidence had vanished in a single night, leaving behind only the photos on his phone. Photos he'd been smart enough to upload to a secure cloud storage account before going to bed. Eli stood in his wrecked living room, surveying the damage with a mixture of fear and determination. They'd sent a message: stop digging, or face consequences. But they'd also confirmed that his investigation was getting close to something they desperately wanted to keep hidden. His phone buzzed with a text from Karen. "Meet me at Mammoth Terraces, north side. Come alone." 30 minutes later, Eli found Karen standing on the limestone terraces that gave Mammoth Hot Springs its name, her park ranger uniform stark against the white mineral deposits. Steam rose from the thermal features around them, creating an otherworldly landscape that felt appropriate for the conversation they were about to have. "They hit your place," she said without preamble. How did you know? Because they're watching all of us now. Anyone who's asked too many questions. Anyone who's shown too much interest in the wrong data. Karen gestured toward the thermal features. You see these springs? They've been active for thousands of years, but their flow patterns have changed dramatically in the past 18 months. The thermal system is destabilizing. Why are you telling me this? Because you deserve to know what you've stumbled into. Karen's expression was grim. I told you I worked on the deep bore project. What I didn't tell you is why I really left. She led him away from the main viewing area, down a maintenance trail that wound behind the limestone formations. The drilling operation was based out of a temporary facility near the Norris Geyser Basin. Officially, we were installing seismic monitoring equipment at depth that would provide better data about magma chamber activity. But that wasn't the real purpose. The real purpose was to tap into the magma chamber and create controlled release valves. The theory was sound. If you could bleed off pressure gradually, you might prevent a catastrophic eruption, or at least delay it long enough to develop better evacuation procedures. They emerged onto a small plateau that offered a clear view of the valley below. In the distance, Eli could see the geometric lines of roads and buildings that marked human presence in the wilderness, tiny and fragile against the vast landscape. What went wrong? Everything. The magma chamber is far more complex than the models predicted. Instead of bleeding off pressure, the venting systems created new pathways for thermal activity. The timeline for eruption may have been accelerated rather than delayed. Karen pulled a small device from her pocket, an encrypted satellite phone that Eli recognized as military hardware. Tom Rodriguez was the lead contractor on the drilling team. Geothermal engineer, 23 years of experience, 3 kids. He started asking questions about why the pressure readings weren't matching the theoretical models. What happened to him? Vehicle accident on a mountain road. Lost control on a curve, went over a cliff. Very tragic. Very convenient. Karen's jaw tightened. Except Tom was one of the most careful drivers I'd ever met, and he'd driven that road hundreds of times. Also, his personal notes about the pressure anomalies disappeared from his trailer the same night he died. The implication was clear and terrifying. Eli was looking at a conspiracy that had already committed murder to protect its secrets. His ransacked apartment wasn't just a warning, it was a preview of what could happen if he continued to threaten their operational security. Why haven't you gone public with this? With what? A story about a secret government project with no documentation, a convenient accident with no witnesses, and seismic data that gets scrubbed from official records. Karen shook her head. They've been very careful to keep everything compartmentalized. Most of the people involved only know pieces of the puzzle. But together we know enough to expose them. Together we know enough to get killed. Karen handed him the satellite phone. This is encrypted and routes through military satellites. They can't monitor it easily. If something happens to me, use it to contact investigative journalists. The access codes are programmed in. As they walked back toward the main trail, Eli felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He was now part of a resistance movement he'd never asked to join, fighting against a conspiracy that had resources and ruthlessness he could barely comprehend. That night, he uploaded everything he'd learned to multiple secure cloud accounts, created encrypted copies of all his evidence, and began drafting detailed summaries that could be understood by journalists without scientific backgrounds. If something happened to him, the truth would still survive. What he didn't know was that Karen Holt had already been marked for elimination, and that his own name had moved to the top of a very short list of people who knew too much to be allowed to live. The conspiracy had spent years perfecting the art of making problematic people disappear without raising suspicions. Eli Grant was about to discover just how efficient they'd become. Chapter 4. The False Flag. Lamar Valley, Yellowstone National Park, June 15th, 2017. The video went viral within hours of being uploaded. Shot on a tourist's smartphone from the Lamar Valley overlook, it showed something that no park official could easily explain away. Nearly 1,000 bison streaming eastward in a coordinated exodus, that looked more like a military retreat than seasonal migration. Eli watched the footage for the 12th time, pausing on frames that showed the animals' behaviour. Their ears were pinned back, their movements urgent and purposeful. These weren't animals wandering to new grazing areas. They were fleeing something that had triggered every survival instinct evolution had given them. The official response came within 6 hours. Park spokeswoman Janet Morrison appeared on CNN to explain that large herbivore migrations were completely normal, and that social media was creating panic over natural phenomena that occur regularly in Yellowstone. What Morrison didn't mention was that the bison were fleeing from a section of the park that had been closed to public access for the past 3 months. The Norrisback Basin, officially under restoration after minor geothermal changes, was actually experiencing subsurface temperatures that had increased by nearly 40 degrees Celsius in the past year. Eli had seen the classified reports. New fumaroles were opening weekly. The ground temperature was rising so rapidly that park maintenance crews couldn't approach the monitoring equipment without protective suits. Most telling of all, the area was showing magnetic anomalies consistent with massive metallic intrusions, exactly what you'd expect if the magma chamber was rising toward the surface. His phone buzzed with a message from Karen. "Need to show you something. Tonight. Usual place." They met after midnight at the Mammoth Terraces, their breath visible in the cold mountain air. Karen looked haggard, her face showing the strain of months spent living with dangerous knowledge. "I've been monitoring radio traffic from the restricted zones," she said without preamble. "FEMA has been conducting something called Operation Continuity. Not training exercises, actual deployment." "Deployment of what?" "Command and control infrastructure. They've been installing communication arrays, power systems, and what sounds like permanent housing facilities." Karen pulled out a topographic map marked with red circles. "All of these locations correspond to abandoned Cold War bunkers or natural cave systems. They're building something underground." Eli studied the map. The marked locations formed a rough circle around the Yellowstone caldera, each one positioned outside the immediate blast zone, but close enough to maintain operational oversight of the area. How many people could these facilities support? Based on the supply manifests I've been able to intercept, maybe 2,000 people per facility. Enough for essential government personnel and their families, plus a skeleton crew to maintain basic infrastructure. The scope of the deception was staggering. While telling the public that Yellowstone posed no immediate threat, the government was quietly building underground cities designed to preserve a small fraction of the population through the greatest natural disaster in human history. "I want to see one of these facilities." Karen shook her head. "Too dangerous. They've got military-grade security at all the sites now." "Then how do we prove any of this exists?" "We don't. Not directly." Karen handed him a small device that looked like a modified GPS unit. "But we can document the construction activity. This is a ground-penetrating radar unit, modified to detect large underground structures. If we can map the facilities from the surface, we can prove they exist without having to penetrate their security." 2 nights later, they drove to a remote area near the Shoshone National Forest, following Forest Service roads that weren't marked on any public maps. The official designation was a wildlife research station, but the facilities visible from the access road looked more like a military installation than a scientific outpost. Chain-link fencing topped with razor wire surrounded the compound. Guard towers equipped with searchlights and what appeared to be automated weapon systems monitored the perimeter. Most telling of all, massive air conditioning units and ventilation systems indicated that whatever was happening here required significant life support infrastructure. Karen set up the ground-penetrating radar while Eli photographed everything he could see from their concealed position. The radar readings revealed the truth. Beneath the modest surface facilities lay a complex that extended at least 5 levels underground, with enough space to house thousands of people for extended periods. "My God," Eli whispered as he studied the readouts. "It's like an underground city." "One of at least 6 that we know of," Karen replied. "And this is just what they're building in Wyoming and Montana. Intelligence suggests similar facilities are under construction throughout the western United States. As they packed up their equipment, Eli felt a mixture of vindication and terror. They now had proof that the government was secretly preparing for a Yellowstone eruption, while publicly denying any threat existed. But they also had evidence of a conspiracy so vast and well-funded that challenging it openly would be tantamount to suicide. The drive back to Gardner was tense and quiet. Both of them understood that they'd crossed a line tonight, moving from passive observation to active intelligence gathering. The people behind the conspiracy would not tolerate this kind of direct surveillance for long. Karen was right to be worried. Unknown to either of them, their activities had been monitored by satellite surveillance systems designed to detect exactly this kind of unauthorized reconnaissance. Facial recognition algorithms had identified them both, and their vehicle's license plate had been flagged in law enforcement databases across the region. Within hours, orders would be issued for their immediate apprehension and detention. The conspiracy had decided that Karen Holt and Eli Grant had become too dangerous to remain free. But first, they had to be isolated from any support networks or escape routes. The plan that had been set in motion would ensure that when they disappeared, no one would think to look for them until it was far too late to matter. Chapter 5. The Smoking Gun. Secure conference room, undisclosed location, August 3rd, 2017. The recording device was smaller than a matchbox, designed to look like a routine equipment monitoring sensor of the type found throughout government facilities. Eli had placed it in the ventilation system of conference room C7 3 hours earlier, using his maintenance access codes to enter the secure wing of the Denver Federal Building. What he captured on that device would become the smoking gun that proved everything he'd suspected about the Yellowstone conspiracy. The voices on the recording were clearly identifiable. Deputy Director Webb from FEMA, Assistant Secretary of Interior Patricia Vance, and at least 2 other officials whose identities Eli couldn't immediately determine. Their conversation was conducted with the casual tone of people who believed they were speaking in complete privacy. The latest projections show we're ahead of schedule, Webb's voice came through clearly. Thermal expansion in the Norris sector is accelerating faster than the models predicted. How much faster? Vance asked. 18 to 24 months ahead of the original timeline. We may be looking at a 2029 event rather than 2031. The sound of papers shuffling was audible before another voice joined the conversation. The infrastructure projects are proceeding on schedule, but we'll need to accelerate the relocation of essential personnel if the timeline has moved up. What about public disclosure? Vance asked. Webb's laugh was bitter. Public disclosure remains a non-option. We've run every scenario through the simulation models. Even with a full year of advance warning, we couldn't evacuate more than 15% of the affected population. The interstate system would collapse within hours, supply chains would break down completely, and we'd face massive social unrest that would interfere with Tier 1 evacuation procedures. So we maintain the current posture? We maintain the lie, Webb corrected. Continue the public briefings about normal seismic activity. Continue dismissing online speculation as conspiracy theories. And most importantly, continue the media relationships that keep investigative journalists focused on other stories. Eli's hands trembled as he listened to the casual discussion of abandoning hundreds of millions of people to die. These weren't comic book villains plotting world domination. They were mid-level government bureaucrats who had decided that preserving their own lives and positions was more important than honouring their oath to serve the public. The recording continued with logistical discussions that were even more damning. Supply caches were being positioned at the underground facilities. Communication networks that would remain operational during and after the eruption were being tested. Even arrangements for maintaining genetic diversity in the post-eruption population were being planned with clinical efficiency. What about the monitoring station personnel? An unidentified voice asked. Some of them are asking uncomfortable questions. We're handling that, Webb replied. Enhanced security protocols, selective information sharing, and when necessary, personnel reassignments to less sensitive positions. What about the ones who have already seen too much? Problem solved? Webb's voice carried a note of finality that made Eli's stomach turn. The park ranger who was asking questions about the deep bore project will be transferred to a remote station in Alaska next week. A routine reassignment that gets her away from Yellowstone and limits her access to sensitive information. Karen. They were talking about Karen, and Eli knew with sickening certainty that her reassignment would be permanent in ways that had nothing to do with Park Service bureaucracy. The meeting concluded with assignments and timelines that painted a clear picture of a conspiracy in its final phases. The underground facilities would be fully operational by 2028. Essential personnel would begin training exercises that were actually disguised evacuations by early 2029, and the public would remain completely unaware until the eruption made further secrecy impossible. Eli retrieved the recording device later that night, his heart pounding as he navigated the empty corridors of the federal building. The evidence he now possessed was explosive enough to bring down the entire conspiracy, if he could find a way to get it to journalists who couldn't be intimidated or discredited. But first he had to warn Karen about her impending reassignment. He tried calling her cell phone but got no answer. Her ranger station reported that she was off duty and couldn't be reached for routine inquiries. Growing increasingly worried, Eli drove to her apartment in Mammoth Hot Springs, only to find it dark and apparently empty. Karen's supervisor, when Eli finally tracked him down, was apologetic but unhelpful. Officer Holt has been temporarily assigned to a special project in Alaska. She left this morning on a charter flight. Very sudden, but you know how it is with Park Service priorities. Eli knew exactly how it was. Karen Holt had become a liability, and liabilities were being eliminated with bureaucratic efficiency. Her disappearance was a warning and a preview of his own fate if he continued to threaten the conspiracy's operational security. That night, he uploaded the recording to multiple secure servers and began reaching out to investigative journalists whose work suggested they couldn't be easily intimidated. The evidence was now beyond their ability to suppress completely, but Eli understood that possessing it had made him the most dangerous man in America. He was no longer just a witness to the conspiracy. He was the only person outside their organisation who could prove it existed, and that made him a target that couldn't be allowed to remain free. Chapter 6. The Countdown. Gardner, Montana, November 12, 2017. The email from ProPublica journalist Michael Chen arrived at 3:47 a.m, marked with encryption protocols that indicated he'd taken Eli's warnings about government surveillance seriously. The message was brief, but electrifying. Audio verified by 3 independent sources. Document analysis confirms authenticity. Ready to publish. Needs secure meeting to discuss protection protocols. Eli had been living as a fugitive in his own life for 3 months, changing locations nightly and communicating only through encrypted channels. The strain was showing. He'd lost 20 pounds, developed chronic insomnia, and started checking his rearview mirror obsessively whenever he drove. But Chen's message confirmed that the months of careful evidence gathering had finally produced results that couldn't be dismissed or discredited. What Eli didn't know was that his encrypted communications had been compromised for weeks, and that every message he'd sent to journalists was being monitored by the same people he was trying to expose. The conspiracy's response was swift and multi-pronged. Within hours of Chen's message, every major news network received exclusive briefings from USGS officials debunking dangerous misinformation about Yellowstone. The briefings included carefully edited seismic data, testimonials from concerned scientists about the psychological damage caused by eruption rumours, and veiled threats about the national security implications of spreading geological panic. Chen's editor killed the story before it could be published. The official reason was insufficient corroboration from government sources. The real reason became clear when Chen contacted Eli through secure channels. ProPublica's major donors had received calls from federal officials suggesting that publishing unverified geological speculation could affect the organisation's non-profit status. But the conspiracy had underestimated the modern information landscape. Eli's evidence had been distributed to dozens of journalists, bloggers, and citizen researchers, while mainstream media outlets could be pressured into silence. The decentralized nature of online publishing made complete suppression impossible. On November the 15th, the story broke simultaneously across 17 different platforms. Independent journalists published the recordings. Geology professors confirmed the technical details. Former government employees provided additional context about the classified facilities. Within 48 hours, #Yellowstone Conspiracy was trending globally. The government's response was predictable and desperate. Official spokespeople dismissed the evidence as sophisticated disinformation designed to undermine public confidence in scientific institutions. The recordings were declared fabricated using advanced audio manipulation technology. Alternative explanations were provided for every piece of evidence Eli had gathered, but the dam had broken. Whistleblowers within the conspiracy began coming forward with additional documentation. Satellite images of the underground facilities appeared online. Construction workers who had built the secret bunkers shared their stories. Karen Holt, who had been held at a debriefing facility in Alaska, was released and immediately went public with her testimony about the deep bore project. The revelation that the government had been planning to abandon 300 million Americans to die while saving only a privileged few sparked the largest protests in American history. Demonstrations erupted in every major city. Congressional hearings were demanded. International allies expressed outrage at being kept in the dark about a disaster that would affect global climate and agriculture. Most importantly, real evacuation planning finally began. With the truth exposed, it became impossible to maintain the fiction that Yellowstone posed no threat. Scientists worked around the clock to develop actual emergency response procedures. International cooperation emerged as other countries offered to assist with evacuation and resettlement efforts. Chapter 7. The Final Message. Yellowstone National Park, January 20th, 2029. Eli stood on the Lamar Valley overlook, watching steam rise from thermal features that had doubled in intensity over the past 18 months. The park was nearly empty now. Evacuations had begun 6 months earlier when seismic activity had become impossible to hide. The animals had fled long ago, following instincts older than human civilization. His phone buzzed with an encrypted message from the Global Yellowstone Monitoring Consortium, an international scientific collaboration that had formed after the conspiracy's exposure. Seismic precursors accelerating. Event window now estimated at 72 to 96 hours. Final evacuation protocols activated. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same evidence that the conspiracy had tried to suppress for decades was now being used to save millions of lives. The underground facilities that had been built for a privileged few were being converted into evacuation centres for ordinary families. The communication networks designed to preserve government continuity were now coordinating the largest humanitarian operation in human history. Not everyone could be saved. The logistics were still overwhelming, but transparency had enabled genuine preparation instead of elite preservation. International agreements had been signed to relocate climate refugees. Agricultural systems had been modified to function with altered growing conditions. Supply chains had been restructured to survive massive disruption. Eli's satellite phone rang. Karen's voice came through clearly from her position at the Evacuation Coordination Center in Denver. "Final transport leaves Gardner in 30 minutes, she reported. "You need to be on it." "I'll be there," Eli replied, but he remained standing on the overlook for several more minutes. Below him, Yellowstone spread out in its terrible beauty, a landscape that had remained largely unchanged for thousands of years, about to be transformed by forces that made human concerns seem trivial. His phone's camera was still recording as he delivered his final message. "This is Eli Grant, reporting from Yellowstone National Park on January 20th, 2029. In approximately 3 days, this place will become ground zero for the largest volcanic eruption in human history. But unlike the conspiracy originally planned, This won't be a secret apocalypse that kills hundreds of millions while saving a few thousand elites. Because the truth came out, we've had time to prepare. Not perfectly, not completely, but honestly. The people fleeing this region know what's coming and why. The international community is ready to help. The aftermath will be terrible, but it won't be hidden, and it won't be used to justify abandoning the principles of democratic society. If you're watching this from the future, remember that transparency saved lives. Remember that ordinary people, when given truth instead of lies, are capable of extraordinary cooperation. And remember that the greatest disasters are always made worse by the people who try to profit from them instead of preventing them. As he walked back to his truck for the final drive to the evacuation point, Eli felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not for avoiding the catastrophe, that was beyond human power to prevent, but hope that when the crisis came, humanity would face it together rather than divided by the lies of those who value their own survival above everyone else's. Epilogue: The Quiet After the Storm. New Geneva, International Reconstruction Zone, January 20th, 2034. 5 years after the Yellowstone eruption, Eli Grant stood before the International Truth and Reconciliation Commission, delivering testimony that would help ensure such a conspiracy could never again threaten global security. The hearing was being broadcast live to millions of survivors in refugee communities across 6 continents. The eruption had been as devastating as predicted. Ash fallout had disrupted global agriculture for 3 years. Climate patterns had shifted dramatically, and large areas of North America remained uninhabitable. But because the truth had emerged in time, the disaster had brought out humanity's cooperative instincts rather than its destructive ones. The Yellowstone conspiracy taught us that the greatest threats to human survival aren't natural disasters. Eli concluded his testimony. They're the institutions that respond to those disasters by protecting themselves at the expense of everyone else. Transparency isn't just an ideal, it's a survival strategy. In the audience, Karen Holt nodded her approval. She now directed the Global Early Warning Network, an international organisation dedicated to ensuring that geological threats could never again be hidden from the public. Around the world, the underground facilities originally built for elite preservation had been converted into research stations, museums and memorials dedicated to democratic accountability. The Yellowstone conspiracy had been exposed just in time to save millions of lives, but more importantly, it had revealed the difference between a society that prepares for disaster together and one that allows the powerful to abandon everyone else when crisis strikes. As Eli walked out of the hearing room into the rebuilt world beyond, he carried with him the knowledge that sometimes the most dangerous secrets are the ones we tell ourselves we're keeping for everyone's own good. The truth, no matter how terrifying, is always preferable to a lie that serves only the few at the expense of the many.